December 22nd, 1849, Semyonovsky Square, St. Petersburg. The blindfold is tight against Fyodor Dostoevsky's eyes. His hands are bound behind him. For 8 agonizing minutes, he stands before the firing squad, waiting for the command that will end his life. The rifles are raised. The order to aim echoes across the frozen square. Then, at the final moment, a white flag appears. The execution is stopped. The 28-year-old revolutionary conspirator has been granted life by imperial whim. How do you live after staring into the abyss of your own mortality? How do you find meaning after discovering that existence hangs by the thread of arbitrary power? How do you maintain faith in human dignity after witnessing the depths of human cruelty? These aren't abstract philosophical problems. They were the lived reality that forged Dostoevsky's revolutionary understanding of human consciousness. This transformative near-death experience, combined with his lifelong epilepsy and 4 years of Siberian imprisonment, gave Dostoevsky unparalleled insight into what he would call the underground territories of modern consciousness. He declared himself a child of doubt and unbelief, who nevertheless became one of Christianity's most profound defenders. His personal extremity, psychological, physical, and spiritual, positioned him to see aspects of human nature that remained invisible to more comfortable thinkers. From this crucible emerged a revolutionary understanding. Modern consciousness is fundamentally divided against itself. I am convinced that man will never renounce real suffering, he wrote in Notes from Underground. This wasn't philosophical speculation, but lived knowledge, the insight of someone who had descended into the underground and returned to map its territories. What he found there was both terrifying and redemptive. He discovered freedom as burden rather than liberation, consciousness itself as a form of disease, and love as the only force capable of transforming suffering into meaning. He saw through rationalist promises of utopia to the totalitarian nightmare beneath. He understood that the modern crisis is fundamentally spiritual, not political or technological, requiring transformation of consciousness itself rather than mere social reform. Dostoevsky matters uniquely amongst thinkers because he alone combined the deepest psychological realism with the highest spiritual aspiration. His significance lies not in providing comfortable answers, but in showing us the actual terrain of spiritual struggle that every conscious person must navigate, both the abyss of modern consciousness and the possibility of its redemption. The underground awaits. What he discovered there remains essential for understanding ourselves. Part 1, the underground consciousness. The underground man stands as Dostoevsky's most shocking philosophical discovery, a consciousness that has turned violently against itself, caught in the impossible position of being too intelligent to believe in rational progress, yet too honest to embrace comfortable illusions. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man, he declares from his underground burrow, but this sickness reveals something profound about the human condition under rationalist civilization. When he insists that 2 times 2 makes 4 is not life, gentlemen, but the beginning of death, he articulates a rebellion that cuts to the heart of modernity's deepest assumptions about human nature. This is not the confession of a madman, but the logical endpoint of rational consciousness applied to itself. The underground man has absorbed completely the Enlightenment promise that human behavior operates according to discoverable laws, that self-interest can be calculated with mathematical precision, that reason will inevitably guide us toward happiness and progress. Yet precisely because he understands this system so thoroughly, he recognizes its fundamental impossibility when applied to actual human experience. The rationalist vision reduces consciousness to a machine that processes inputs and produces predictable outputs. But consciousness rebels against this reduction through the very act of understanding it. The underground consciousness emerges from this terrible clarity. Having seen through the rational system, the underground man discovers that his only remaining freedom lies in deliberate self-sabotage, in choosing to act against his own interests, simply to prove that he cannot be reduced to a mathematical equation. He threatens to stick out his tongue at any crystal palace of rational organization, and this seemingly childish gesture carries enormous philosophical weight. It represents the irreducible human capacity to say no, to choose irrationally, to preserve something mysterious and unpredictable in human nature against all systematic attempts to contain it. This revolt operates through spite, but spite becomes a strange form of dignity. The underground man's irrational behavior is paradoxically rational as the only way to maintain his humanity against mechanical predictability. He suffers deliberately, chooses poorly, acts against his own happiness precisely because these choices prove he remains free. His consciousness splits against itself. The rational part recognizes what would benefit him, whilst the spiteful part refuses to comply with this recognition. This division creates the underground mentality that would define modern consciousness. Dostoevsky anticipated the entire existentialist tradition through this insight, but with a crucial difference that reveals his deeper philosophical vision. Where later thinkers like Sartre would celebrate radical freedom as liberation, the underground man suffers from his freedom, experiences it as a burden that isolates him from any stable foundation for action. His consciousness achieves perfect clarity about the impossibility of rational systems, but this clarity offers no comfort, no alternative vision, only the endless repetition of revolt against inadequate solutions. The underground thus becomes the space where modern consciousness discovers both its freedom and its homelessness. Having rejected rational systems that claim to solve human nature, consciousness finds itself without guidance, forced to create meaning through the very act of rejection itself. This creates the fundamental tension that drives Dostoevsky's entire philosophical project. If reason cannot contain human nature, and if pure freedom offers only suffering and isolation, what possibility remains for authentic human existence? Dostoevsky's most radical psychological insight emerges from the underground. Consciousness itself functions as a disease. The underground man declares with bitter pride, "I am convinced that man will never renounce real suffering," that is, destruction and chaos, while simultaneously insisting that consciousness is infinitely superior to twice 2 makes 4. This paradox reveals the fundamental pathology of modern awareness. The more conscious we become, the more we suffer. Yet we cannot choose unconsciousness without losing our humanity entirely. The mechanism operates with cruel precision. Consciousness brings knowledge of our limitations, mortality, and moral complexity, making simple happiness impossible for the truly aware person. Where animals act from instinct and simple people follow convention, the conscious individual sees through every motivation, questions every impulse, and discovers the mechanical nature of what others take for authentic feeling. This knowledge becomes a burden that cannot be set down. The underground man knows too much about his own psychology to act spontaneously, yet cannot unknow what he knows. More disturbing still, underground consciousness becomes addicted to its own pain. The underground man finds in suffering a proof of his reality and uniqueness that rational happiness cannot provide. His pain becomes his identity, his badge of authenticity in a world of mechanical responses. He analyzes with perverse satisfaction how he savors his toothache, finding in physical pain a perfect metaphor for the spiritual pain of consciousness. The ache proves he exists as more than a mathematical formula, more than the sum of rational calculations that would determine his behavior. This addiction reveals the specifically modern form of alienation, not separation from others, but separation from oneself. The underground man desperately craves human connection, whilst his hyper-awareness makes genuine contact impossible. He sees through his own attempts at sincerity, analyzes his own emotions as they arise, and discovers self-interest lurking beneath every apparently noble gesture. This self-knowledge becomes a prison more confining than any external constraint. The underground thus represents the dead end of pure individualism. Consciousness turned entirely inward becomes paralysis rather than liberation. The underground man's freedom to think anything leads not to authentic choice, but to the inability to choose at all. He can see every option, predict every consequence, analyze every motive, and in this perfect awareness finds himself frozen, unable to act with the spontaneous conviction that makes life possible. Dostoevsky reveals why rational individualism, pursued to its logical conclusion, produces not freedom but suffering. The promise of consciousness that awareness would liberate us from convention and superstition proves false when consciousness becomes total. Perfect self-knowledge creates not the autonomous individual, but the paralyzed observer of his own psychological mechanisms, trapped in the underground of his own making. The Crystal Palace stands as Dostoevsky's most penetrating symbol for the rationalist dream that haunted his age and continues to haunt ours. This wasn't merely literary invention. Dostoevsky had witnessed the actual Crystal Palace at the 1851 London exhibition, that magnificent iron and glass cathedral to human progress, where the fruits of industrial civilization were displayed with triumphant confidence. Here was architecture as ideology, transparent, rational, perfectly functional. Every beam calculated, every pane of glass serving its purpose, the whole structure proclaiming humanity's mastery over nature through reason and technology. But Dostoevsky saw something else in this gleaming monument. He recognized it as the architectural embodiment of Western civilization's deepest faith that human problems could be solved through scientific planning, that society could be organized as rationally as this building, that happiness could be engineered through the proper arrangement of material conditions and social systems. The Crystal Palace became his shorthand for any perfectly organized society where all human needs are met through rational calculation and enlightened self-interest. The genius of Dostoevsky's insight lies in recognizing that such a rationally perfect society would prove psychologically unbearable precisely because of its perfection, not because it would be oppressive in any obvious sense, but because it would eliminate the very possibility of genuine choice and moral struggle that makes us human. This is the underground man's profound rebellion, crystallized in his seemingly absurd threat, and what if I should want to stick out my tongue at you? That childish gesture contains multitudes. It represents the irreducible human need to assert freedom against all systems, even beneficial ones, especially beneficial ones. The underground man isn't rebelling against tyranny. He's rebelling against a system so perfectly calibrated to human needs that it leaves no room for the messy, irrational, self-destructive choices that constitute authentic human agency. The problem with the Crystal Palace isn't that it's evil, but that it's too good. It solves human problems without allowing humans to solve them themselves. This reveals Dostoevsky's anticipation of totalitarianism's fundamental philosophical error, the assumption that human nature can be perfected through external organization. Whether the system calls itself capitalist or socialist, whether it promises prosperity or equality, it fails the moment it treats freedom as a problem to be solved rather than the essential condition of human dignity. The Crystal Palace represents every utopian project that would trade authentic choice for guaranteed outcomes. Dostoevsky understood that both material prosperity and social justice, however desirable, become forms of tyranny when they're imposed rather than chosen. The underground man's rebellion reveals a disturbing truth. People will choose suffering over happiness if happiness comes at the cost of genuine freedom. They will act against their own rational self-interest simply to prove that they can. This isn't perversity, it's the assertion of what makes us human. The Crystal Palace fails because it cannot accommodate this irreducible human element. Any system that claims to have solved the human problem must eventually treat continued human dissatisfaction as pathology to be cured rather than freedom to be respected. The perfectly rational society becomes irrational the moment it encounters the human being who refuses to be perfectly rational. This creates a profound paradox that Dostoevsky never fully resolved, but which drives his entire philosophical project forward. If human beings cannot accept even beneficial constraints on their freedom, if they will rebel against paradise itself, what does authentic freedom actually require? The underground man's cry from beneath the floorboards suggests that freedom might demand something far more radical than any political or economic system can provide, something that touches the very foundations of human existence itself. Part 2. The psychology of freedom. Freedom, for Dostoevsky, represents not humanity's liberation, but its most terrible burden, the crushing weight of choice without certainty, action without guarantees. This revolutionary understanding emerges most powerfully through Raskolnikov's Torment in Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist's freedom to commit murder becomes a psychological weight that nearly destroys him. His anguished question echoes through the novel: am I a trembling creature, or have I the right? Here, freedom manifests not as joyful possibility, but as existential anxiety, the terrifying recognition that we must choose and act despite our fundamental uncertainty about what we should do. Dostoevsky's conception of freedom necessarily includes the freedom to destroy oneself and others. This cannot be limited to good choices without ceasing to be freedom altogether. Through Raskolnikov's crime, we see how authentic freedom must encompass the possibility of evil, otherwise it becomes merely the illusion of choice within predetermined parameters. This capacity for motiveless malignity, for acting against one's own interests, distinguishes human freedom from animal instinct and mechanical causation. The murderer chooses his crime not from hunger or passion, but from the terrible recognition that he can choose it, that nothing prevents him except his own will. The psychological realism of how freedom manifests in consciousness reveals itself as anxiety about the future, guilt about the past, and the desperate search for something to believe in that might guide choice. Ivan Karamazov's intellectual torment demonstrates how the rational mind experiences freedom's burden through endless analysis and doubt. Dimitri's passionate confusion shows how emotional natures feel freedom as overwhelming intensity, the inability to control one's responses to life's demands. Yet both temperaments share the fundamental experience of freedom's weight, the recognition that they must choose without adequate knowledge of consequences. This creates Dostoevsky's central paradox: freedom, which should represent humanity's greatest gift, becomes its greatest source of suffering because it makes us responsible for outcomes we cannot control or fully predict. The underground man embodies this contradiction perfectly. His hyper-consciousness of his freedom to choose becomes the source of his paralysis, his ability to see all possibilities, preventing him from committing to any single course of action. The burden intensifies because freedom operates without external validation. We cannot know in advance whether our choices are correct, whether our actions will produce the outcomes we intend, whether we are choosing rightly or wrongly. This uncertainty transforms every significant decision into a leap of faith, every action into a gamble with consequences that extend far beyond our ability to foresee or control them. Dostoevsky reveals how this psychological reality creates the necessity for escape. If freedom proves unbearable, consciousness will seek ways to surrender it, to find relief from the terrible responsibility of choice. The underground prophets emerge from this recognition, offering various forms of salvation from freedom's burden, each carrying its own psychological and moral consequences that shape the human condition in modernity. The Grand Inquisitor stands as Dostoevsky's most penetrating analysis of humanity's willing surrender of freedom for the comfort of security. In this masterpiece within the brothers Karamazov, the aged cardinal confronts Christ himself with a devastating accusation. You wanted man's free love, that he should follow you freely. But you forgot that man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil. The Inquisitor reveals how institutional Christianity has become a mechanism for relieving humanity of freedom's unbearable burden through what he calls miracle, mystery, and authority, the three forces that can subdue human conscience forever. This surrender is not mere weakness, but psychological necessity. The Inquisitor speaks with genuine compassion for the weak masses who cannot bear the terrible gift of free choice. He has taken upon himself the burden of their freedom, creating a system where they can live in peace without the agony of moral decision. The Church, in his vision, becomes a benevolent tyranny that feeds the hungry, comforts the anxious, and most crucially, removes the crushing responsibility of choosing between good and evil. Modern ideologies function as secular versions of this same escape from freedom. In Demons, Dostoevsky shows how revolutionary movements promise certainty in exchange for submission to collective will. Characters like Pyotr Verkovensky seduce others not through rational argument, but by offering relief from the burden of individual moral judgment. The revolutionary surrenders his conscience to the movement, finding in political certainty what the Inquisitor's flock finds in religious authority. Both socialist and nationalist movements exploit this same psychological need, transforming the anxiety of freedom into the comfort of belonging to something greater than oneself. Even love becomes an escape from freedom when it transforms into possessive obsession. Rogozin's passion for Nastasia Filipovna in The Idiot demonstrates how romantic love can become another form of surrender. Rather than maintaining the difficult balance between love and individual autonomy, Rogojin seeks to lose himself completely in his beloved. She becomes his authority, the force that relieves him of the need to choose. His love is not liberation, but another form of submission, where the beloved replaces God or ideology as the external source of meaning and direction. These escapes from freedom are not simply moral failures, but psychologically understandable responses to a genuinely difficult condition. Dostoevsky's profound compassion for characters who choose submission reveals his understanding that freedom's burden is real, not imaginary. The underground man's paralysis, the Grand Inquisitor's paternalism, Rogojin's obsession, all represent authentic attempts to solve the problem of human freedom. This creates the crucial question that haunts all of Dostoevsky's work. If most people cannot bear authentic freedom, and escapes from freedom inevitably lead to various forms of tyranny, what would genuine choice and moral responsibility actually look like in practice? Authentic freedom emerges only when one accepts complete responsibility for one's choices without external justification. Neither divine command, nor social convention, nor rational calculation can relieve the individual of the burden of choice. Dostoevsky understood that this burden is not a flaw in human design, but the very foundation of human dignity. Through Alyosha Karamazov's decision to leave the monastery, we witness authentic freedom in action. Alyosha doesn't abandon faith or reject his spiritual calling. Rather, he chooses active engagement with the world as his form of spiritual service. This choice cannot be justified through theological reasoning or social expectation. It emerges from his recognition that his responsibility to humanity requires him to embrace uncertainty rather than retreat into the safety of monastic certainty. The paradox of moral freedom reveals itself most powerfully through Dmitry Karamazov's acceptance of suffering for a crime he didn't commit. Dmitry's declaration strikes at the heart of authentic responsibility. I accept the torture of accusation and my public shame. I want to suffer, and by suffering I shall be purified. This represents neither masochism nor irrational self-punishment, but the recognition that moral responsibility extends far beyond what can be legally proven or rationally calculated. Dmitry understands that his moral culpability for his father's death transcends his legal innocence. His hatred, his violent desires, his moral failures created the conditions that made the murder possible. By accepting responsibility beyond guilt, Dmitry achieves a form of freedom that legal exoneration could never provide. Dostoevsky's profound insight reveals that moral responsibility cannot be based on rational calculation of consequences, but requires a leap of faith in human dignity that cannot be proven. Sonia's love for Raskolnikov demonstrates this principle with devastating clarity. Her choice to love him cannot be justified through utilitarian reasoning. Raskolnikov has murdered an innocent woman and shows no remorse. Yet Sonia acts from love rather than fear or self-interest, even when the outcome remains uncertain and the cost proves enormous. Her authentic moral choice creates the possibility for Raskolnikov's transformation, not through argument or manipulation, but through the sheer fact of her commitment to his human worth, despite all evidence to the contrary. The psychology of authentic choice involves embracing uncertainty whilst acting from commitment to values that transcend immediate self-interest. This form of freedom doesn't eliminate anxiety, but transforms it from paralyzing fear into creative tension. The person who achieves authentic freedom doesn't escape the burden of choice, but learns to carry it as the price of human dignity. This understanding reveals freedom not as license to do whatever one desires, but as the capacity to act from deep conviction, even when external supports fail. Such freedom creates profound responsibility because it eliminates all excuses. One cannot blame society, genetics, circumstances, or even God for choices made in full awareness of their moral weight. This recognition of freedom as responsibility rather than license creates the foundation for confronting the reality of evil in human experience. Part 3. The Problem of Evil. Ivan Karamazov stands as Dostoevsky's most formidable challenger to religious faith, yet his rebellion operates on grounds far more sophisticated than simple atheism. His quarrel with God concerns not divine existence, but moral acceptability, the fundamental question of whether any ultimate good could justify the reality of innocent suffering. It's not God that I don't accept, Alyosha, Ivan declares to his younger brother. Only I most respectfully return him the ticket. This gesture of returning his admission ticket to God's creation represents a moral revolt that cuts deeper than intellectual doubt, challenging the very framework within which divine justice might be understood. Ivan's rebellion gains its devastating force through his methodical catalogue of human cruelty, particularly toward children. He recounts with clinical precision the Turkish soldiers who amuse themselves by tossing babies into the air and catching them on their bayonets, the parents who punish their 5-year-old daughter by locking her in a freezing outhouse through the winter night while she beats her little chest with her tiny fists, crying, "Dear, kind God." These examples are not randomly chosen. They focus relentlessly on the suffering of those who cannot possibly deserve punishment, who have committed no sin that could justify their torment. Through this catalogue, Dostoevsky confronts evil not as the mere absence of good, as traditional theodicy suggests, but as a positive force with its own terrible creativity, is less than #0. 5. The philosophical sophistication of Ivan's position emerges in its self-conscious moral foundation. He rejects God precisely in the name of justice and compassion, wielding moral sensitivity as a weapon against a supposed source of morality itself. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, he insists, even if I were wrong. This creates a profound paradox, the very moral feelings that drive him to atheism. His outrage at injustice, his compassion for the innocent, might themselves require a transcendent source. Ivan's rebellion thus becomes philosophically unstable, using moral absolutes to deny the ground of moral absolutes. This instability reveals the deeper inadequacy of rational theodicy, those systematic attempts to justify God's ways through logical argument. Ivan's position demonstrates that the problem of evil cannot be resolved through intellectual solutions, but only confronted existentially. No amount of reasoning about greater goods, soul-making, or divine mystery can answer the cry of a tortured child. The rebellion shows that evil's challenge to faith operates not primarily in the realm of logic, but in the realm of moral experience, where abstract justifications crumble before concrete suffering. Yet Ivan's moral revolt carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. By rejecting the metaphysical foundation of morality, whilst maintaining moral passion, he creates an untenable position that points toward nihilism's logical conclusion. His rebellion against innocent suffering paradoxically opens the door to the very amorality that makes such suffering possible. This tension drives toward the recognition that evil manifests not merely as suffering imposed from without, but as a spiritual choice made from within, the choice to live as though moral reality itself were an illusion. The phrase, "if God does not exist, everything is permitted," stands among the most misunderstood declarations in philosophical literature. Ivan Karamazov speaks these words, not as liberation, but as horror, not as a manifesto for freedom, but as recognition of catastrophe. The statement reveals what follows logically when transcendent meaning collapses. Moral distinctions dissolve into arbitrary preference, and the foundation of ethical reality crumbles beneath our feet. Ivan's rebellion against God leads him to this terrifying conclusion against his own deepest wishes. He recognizes that without divine authority, the categories of good and evil become mere human constructions, no more binding than matters of taste. This horror finds its perfect embodiment in Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son who represents Ivan's ideas stripped of Ivan's moral sensitivity. Where Ivan suffers from his conclusions, Smerdyakov embraces them with chilling rationality. If there's no everlasting God, there's no such thing as virtue, and there's no need of it. He reasons with devastating clarity. His murder of Fyodor Karamazov becomes merely a practical matter once moral categories are eliminated entirely. Smerdyakov demonstrates what pure rational nihilism looks like without the emotional rebellion that motivated it. Cold calculation, replacing passionate struggle, indifference, supplanting anguish. Dostoevsky understood that rational atheism, pursued to its logical conclusion, leads not to humanitarian progress, but to moral nihilism. The revolutionary characters in Demons justify any means by their ends, revealing how the elimination of transcendent moral authority makes power the only remaining criterion for action. When ultimate meaning disappears, immediate force fills the vacuum. The psychological insight proves devastating. Human beings cannot live by pure reason alone. They will either create substitute gods or descend into destructive nihilism, but they cannot sustain themselves in the void between belief and unbelief. This intellectual nihilism connects directly to spiritual emptiness. The denial of ultimate meaning creates not liberation, but a void that demands to be filled. This emptiness becomes the space where evil can flourish, not as passionate rebellion against divine order, but as cold indifference to human value itself. Evil emerges not merely as the logical conclusion of atheistic reasoning, but as a positive spiritual reality, the deliberate choice of destruction over creation, of negation over affirmation. The underground consciousness recognizes this void and either recoils in horror or embraces it with terrible consistency. Dostoevsky's most unsettling insight concerns the nature of evil itself, not as psychological malfunction or social conditioning, but as a deliberate spiritual choice. Evil, in his understanding, represents the conscious preference for destruction over creation, death over life, negation over affirmation. This recognition emerges most powerfully through Stavrogin in Demons, a character who embodies spiritual evil in its purest form. Possessed of remarkable intelligence, aesthetic sensitivity, and even magnetic charm, Stavrogin remains fundamentally committed to negation. When Shatov confronts him with the devastating accusation, "You're an atheist because you're a snob of the snobs," he identifies the spiritual core of this evil, the sophisticated rejection of everything sacred, noble, or life-affirming. Stavrogin represents something more terrifying than passionate wickedness or crude brutality. His evil manifests as spiritual emptiness, combined with extraordinary capacity, the ability to perform any action, coupled with the inability to believe in anything. This creates a peculiar form of corruption that operates not through force, but through the communication of spiritual void. His influence over Kirillov, Shatov, and Peter Verkovensky demonstrates how evil spreads through the transmission of nihilistic doubt rather than through coercion. Each of these characters becomes twisted not because Stavrogin compels them toward destruction, but because his presence reveals the possibility that nothing matters, that all values are arbitrary, that existence itself lacks meaning. The corruption occurs through intellectual seduction rather than emotional manipulation. This understanding reveals Dostoevsky's most disturbing recognition about the nature of systematic evil. It emerges not from ignorance or uncontrolled passion, but from educated, sophisticated people who choose destruction with full knowledge of what they're destroying. The revolutionary terrorists he witnessed in Russian society were not primitive brutes, but idealistic young people, often from privileged backgrounds, who had received excellent educations. They possessed the intellectual capacity to understand the value of what they sought to annihilate, yet chose annihilation nonetheless. This pattern anticipates the 20th century's horrific discovery that the greatest systematic evils require not primitive brutality, but modern organization, technical expertise, and educated participation. The spiritual nature of evil means it cannot be explained away through psychological analysis or sociological theory. While environmental factors and personal history may create conditions that make evil choices more likely, the fundamental act of choosing destruction over creation remains irreducible to its causes. Stavrogin's evil cannot be fully explained by his childhood experiences, social position, or psychological makeup. At some point, faced with the choice between affirmation and negation, he chose negation not from ignorance of the alternative, but with full awareness of what he was rejecting. This choice represents a mystery that resists complete rational explanation whilst remaining undeniably real in its effects. This recognition of evil as spiritual reality, rather than mere dysfunction, creates profound implications for how such evil might be confronted. If evil was simply the result of ignorance, education could cure it. If it stemmed from social conditions, reform could eliminate it. But if evil represents a fundamental spiritual choice, then addressing it requires something beyond rational argument or social engineering. The mystery of evil's reality demands an equally mysterious response, one that acknowledges the spiritual dimension of human existence and the possibility of redemption, even for those who have chosen the path of negation. Part 4. Faith, Doubt, and the God Question. Dostoevsky once wrote words that cut to the heart of religious experience. I am a child of doubt and unbelief, and I have been so far, and shall be to the grave. What terrible torments this thirst for faith has cost me and costs me now, which is all the stronger in my soul, the more contrary arguments I find in it. This declaration reveals something revolutionary about faith. It is not naive acceptance, but hard-won conviction achieved through, rather than despite intellectual struggle. The very doubts that seem to threaten faith actually forge it into something unbreakable. This understanding transforms how we read Dostoevsky's religious characters. Their psychological realism lies precisely in showing faith as constant struggle rather than peaceful certainty. Father Zosima, that beacon of spiritual wisdom in the Brothers Karamazov, openly acknowledges his own spiritual battles. Even in his final teachings, he speaks not from a place of settled answers, but from ongoing engagement with life's deepest questions. When Zosima dies and his body decomposes rapidly, causing scandal amongst the faithful, Alyosha experiences his own crisis of faith. This moment reveals Dostoevsky's profound insight. Authentic faith must incorporate doubt as its necessary companion rather than its enemy. Alyosha Karamazov emerges as the embodiment of mature faith precisely because he has absorbed his brother's criticisms and chosen belief despite them. His faith is not ignorant of Ivan's intellectual objections or Dmitri's passionate rebellions. It includes and transcends them. When Ivan presents his devastating critique of divine justice, Alyosha doesn't dismiss it with pious platitudes. Instead, he responds with remarkable honesty. I don't want to corrupt you or turn you from your idea. Perhaps I want to be healed by you. This shows faith as dialogue rather than monologue, as engagement rather than retreat. Dostoevsky's insight anticipates what modern theology would later recognize. Doubt is not faith's enemy, but its purifying fire. Faith which cannot survive intellectual challenge is not worth having, whilst faith that emerges through such challenge becomes unshakable, not because it has answers, but because it has learned to live creatively with ultimate questions. The underground prophets of doubt become the most authentic voices of faith, having descended into the depths of uncertainty and emerged not with certainty but with something deeper, the courage to affirm life's meaning despite its mysteries. This creates faith not as belief in propositions, but as a fundamental life orientation, a way of being in the world that remains open to both questioning and wonder. Dostoevsky transforms Pascal's famous wager into something far more profound than a calculation about eternal rewards and punishments. Where Pascal argued we should bet on God's existence because the potential gains outweigh the risks, Dostoevsky presents faith as a wager about the fundamental nature of reality itself, whether existence possesses ultimate meaning or remains, as Macbeth declared, merely a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This wager cannot be settled through rational demonstration. The evidence appears decidedly mixed. Suffering pervades human experience, death claims every life, and the universe displays apparent indifference to human hopes and moral aspirations. Yet against this seemingly overwhelming testimony to meaninglessness, Dostoevsky places the possibility that spiritual reality underlies all appearances that love, compassion, and moral transformation point toward ultimate truth rather than mere evolutionary accidents. The wager involves betting one's entire existence on one interpretation or the other. Those who choose faith commit themselves to living as though spiritual meaning permeates reality, whilst those who choose atheism commit themselves to living as though material existence exhausts all possibilities. Neither choice can be proven correct through external evidence, yet both demand complete commitment of one's life and energy. Dostoevsky's genius lies in recognizing that faith validates itself not through philosophical arguments, but through its capacity to generate authentic human flourishing. Elder Zosima embodies this principle, teaching that genuine faith manifests in the ability to love without conditions. Love a man even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love and is the highest love on earth. Zosima's faith proves its authenticity not by explaining away suffering, but by responding to it with compassion that transforms both giver, receiver. Sonia Marmeladova demonstrates this transformative power most dramatically. When she reads the story of Lazarus to Raskolnikov, her faith manifests not in theological sophistication, but in her extraordinary capacity to love someone who appears utterly unlovable. Her prostitution, poverty, and social degradation might seem to contradict any notion of divine providence, yet her unwavering commitment to spiritual meaning enables her to see redemptive possibilities where others see only corruption and despair. This understanding reveals faith as fundamentally different from intellectual belief in propositions. Faith becomes a commitment to a way of life that affirms ultimate meaning despite uncertainty and apparent evidence to the contrary. The person of faith chooses to live as though love matters more than power, as though moral transformation remains possible even for the worst criminals, as though suffering can be redemptive rather than merely destructive. The psychological insight proves crucial. The wager of faith transforms the one who makes it. Those who choose faith find their capacity for love and compassion expanding, their ability to see meaning in suffering deepening, their commitment to moral growth strengthening. Those who choose atheism often find themselves increasingly cynical, isolated, and despairing, not because atheism is necessarily false, but because the choice itself shapes the chooser's fundamental orientation toward existence. Dostoevsky recognizes that both choices involve accepting responsibility for profound consequences. If one chooses faith and spiritual reality proves illusory, one has lived a life of beautiful delusion. If one chooses atheism and spiritual reality proves genuine, one has missed the entire point of human existence. Yet the choice itself matters more than being ultimately correct, because the act of choosing transforms the person making the choice. This transformation occurs regardless of whether one's metaphysical beliefs prove accurate. The person who lives as though love and compassion reflect ultimate truth develops capacities for human connection and moral growth that remain valuable whether or not God exists. The person who lives as though only material forces matter develops habits of cynicism and isolation that impoverish human experience, whether or not materialism proves correct. The Grand Inquisitor stands as perhaps Dostoevsky's most devastating critique of institutional Christianity, not as an attack on faith itself, but as an exposure of how religious institutions can betray the very message they claim to preserve. In this parable within the Brothers, Karamazov, the 90-year-old cardinal confronts Christ's return to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and the accusation he levels cuts to the heart of Christianity's deepest tension. The Inquisitor represents the Church's temptation to make faith easier, to provide what he calls miracle, mystery, and authority, instead of demanding the terrible burden of free choice that Christ's message requires. The Inquisitor's indictment rings with the authority of someone who believes he serves humanity's deepest needs. You wanted man's free love, that he should follow you freely, enticed and taken captive by you. In place of the rigid ancient law, man must hereafter, with free heart, decide for himself what is good and what is evil. This freedom, the Inquisitor argues, proves too much for ordinary humanity to bear. People want certainty, security, the comfort of being told what to believe, rather than wrestling with the agonizing choice between good and evil. The Church, in his vision, performs an act of compassion by taking this burden from the masses, creating a system where faith becomes manageable, comfortable, institutional. Yet Christ's response or rather his profound silence, embodies everything the Inquisitor fears about authentic Christianity. This silence represents the refusal to coerce belief, the insistence that faith must remain a free choice, even when freedom makes faith infinitely more difficult and uncertain. Christ offers no arguments, performs no miracles, provides no authorities to settle the question. His silence becomes more powerful than any theological debate because it incarnates the very spiritual freedom the Inquisitor seeks to eliminate. When Christ finally acts, it is only to kiss the old man gently, a gesture of love that doesn't argue but simply offers itself, leaving the Inquisitor entirely free to accept or reject. This creates Dostoevsky's most profound paradox. Defending authentic Christianity might require criticizing the church when it becomes an instrument of spiritual oppression rather than liberation. Dostoevsky himself embodied this tension, remaining deeply committed to orthodox spirituality whilst maintaining sharp criticism of ecclesiastical politics and institutional corruption. His vision suggests the possibility of being more Christian than the Christians, more faithful than the faithful, not through religious superiority, but through the recognition that religious truth cannot be preserved through external authority. The deeper insight emerges that authentic religion must be continually renewed through personal spiritual struggle rather than maintained through institutional preservation. The Grand Inquisitor's system would save Christianity by destroying precisely what makes it Christian: the demand for free spiritual choice, the risk of doubt, the possibility of rejection. His compassionate authoritarianism offers humanity everything except what Christ actually offered: the terrible dignity of spiritual freedom. This understanding of religion as necessarily involving risk and uncertainty becomes foundational for grasping how such faith manifests not in institutional loyalty, but in the concrete practice of love and compassion within human relationships. Part 5. Love, Compassion, and Human Connection. Zosima's monastery teaching cuts through centuries of romantic delusion about love's nature. The elder draws a stark distinction between what he calls active love, concrete service demanding sacrifice, and sentimental love that remains trapped in emotional fantasy. His words carry the weight of lived wisdom. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. Love in dreams is greedy for immediate action, rapidly performed and in the sight of all. But active love is labour and fortitude. This teaching exposes how genuine love requires abandoning the ego's comfortable projections to engage with another's actual reality, not the version we prefer to imagine. The psychological precision of this insight becomes clear when examining the contrast between Rogojin's consuming passion for Nastasia Filipovna and Prince Mishkin's compassionate love. Rogojin's desire burns with intensity, yet it seeks fundamentally to possess and control, to make the beloved conform to his own need rather than serve her authentic good. His love remains ultimately narcissistic, using the other as a mirror for his own desires. Mishkin's love operates from an entirely different center. His feelings for Nastasia Filipovna, whilst equally intense, seek her genuine welfare, even when it costs him personally. He's willing to suffer for her without demanding reciprocity, to see her clearly without the distorting lens of possession. This distinction reveals active love's essential requirement: the sacrifice of ego-driven projections in favour of genuine encounter with another's reality. Sentimental love creates elaborate fantasies about the beloved, loving primarily its own emotional experience rather than the actual person. Active love demands the harder path of seeing others as they truly are, wounded, complex, often difficult, and choosing to serve their authentic flourishing rather than our comfortable illusions about them. Prince Mishkin's seemingly paradoxical declaration that beauty will save the world makes sense within this framework. The beauty he perceives isn't aesthetic perfection, but the spiritual reality of human dignity shining through suffering and failure. His idiocy represents spiritual wisdom that penetrates social conventions to recognize essential worth in every person. When others see only Nastasia Filipovna's shame and degradation, Myshkin perceives her underlying nobility. His love becomes transformative not because it's perfect, but because it's genuine, rooted in truth rather than fantasy. This active love proves its authenticity through concrete actions rather than emotional intensity. It moves beyond the underground consciousness's narcissistic suffering toward genuine connection with others' reality. The underground man remains trapped in his own psychological drama, using others as props in his internal theatre. Active love breaks this pattern by genuinely encountering the other as a separate centre of experience, deserving respect and service. Dostoevsky's insight penetrates to love's practical essence. It transforms suffering from meaningless pain into meaningful service. Active love doesn't eliminate suffering, but gives it purpose through connection with others' needs. The lover discovers that authentic relationship requires abandoning the comfortable position of victim or judge to become a servant of others' genuine good. This transformation creates the foundation for spiritual growth, moving consciousness beyond its self-enclosed prison toward genuine communion with reality. Dostoevsky understood compassion not as sympathy extended from a comfortable distance, but as literal suffering with a willingness to enter completely into another's spiritual torment. This distinction proves crucial throughout his work, particularly in how Sonia responds to Raskolnikov's confession in Crime and Punishment. When Raskolnikov finally reveals his crimes, Sonia doesn't recoil in horror at what he has done to others. Instead, her immediate cry, "What have you done? What have you done to yourself?" reveals her profound grasp of his spiritual condition. She sees instantly through the surface crime to the deeper tragedy, his self-destruction, his severing of himself from humanity, his descent into the underground consciousness that torments him more than any external punishment could. This response demonstrates true compassion because Sonia doesn't position herself as judge or moral superior. She doesn't offer solutions or attempt to minimize his guilt. Rather, she immediately grasps the spiritual agony behind his crime and makes it her own. Her horror isn't directed at his actions, but at the spiritual violence he has inflicted upon himself. This compassion requires enormous courage, the courage to abandon the safety of moral distance and enter fully into another's darkness without being consumed by it. Sonia's love for Raskolnikov reveals how genuine human connection emerges, not through shared joy, but through shared acknowledgement of suffering and moral failure. Her decision to follow him to Siberia represents neither romantic devotion nor martyrdom, but spiritual solidarity with his suffering. She recognizes that his isolation, his separation from humanity through crime, can only be healed through someone willing to share that isolation with him. This sharing doesn't diminish her own spiritual integrity. Rather, it becomes the means through which both achieve redemption. The transformative moment in their relationship occurs when Raskolnikov finally accepts this compassion by recognizing their common humanity in sin and redemption. The breakthrough comes not when his suffering ends, but when he stops suffering alone. Dostoevsky shows how the underground consciousness, that state of radical isolation and self-torment, can only be transcended through this kind of compassionate witness. Sonia's presence doesn't eliminate Raskolnikov's guilt or magically solve his spiritual crisis, but it provides what the underground consciousness most desperately needs: genuine recognition and acceptance without judgment. This compassion operates as practical wisdom that sees through social roles and moral categories to essential human dignity. Sonia loves Raskolnikov, not despite his crime, but through it, recognizing the spiritual struggle that led to his fall. She understands that his crime emerged from the same human condition that affects all people, the capacity for both profound evil and profound good, the struggle between spiritual aspiration and moral failure. Her compassion becomes transformative precisely because it offers recognition without condemnation, understanding without excuses. Through Sonia, Dostoevsky demonstrates how such compassion can transform suffering from meaningless pain into spiritual growth. The suffering itself doesn't disappear, but it acquires meaning through being shared and witnessed by another who refuses to abandon the sufferer to isolation. This shared suffering creates the foundation for genuine human connection and spiritual renewal. Suffering permeates Dostoevsky's world, but he rejects the notion that pain itself carries intrinsic spiritual value. The underground man suffers intensely. His humiliations burn through every page. Yet this suffering breeds only spite, resentment, and calculated cruelty toward others. His pain becomes sterile, feeding on itself, creating nothing but more isolation and bitterness. Contrast this with Sonia Marmeladov, whose profound suffering, poverty, prostitution, her father's alcoholism generates an inexhaustible capacity for compassion. She transforms her pain into service, her degradation into love for others. The difference lies not in the quantity or quality of suffering, but in how each character responds to their wounds. This psychological realism reveals suffering's dual potential. Raskolnikov's journey illustrates this perfectly. The same torment that drives him to murder eventually becomes his path to spiritual renewal. After killing the pawnbroker, his suffering manifests as paranoia, isolation, and contempt for humanity. He sees his pain as evidence of his superiority, his sensitivity proof of his extraordinary nature. Yet when Sonia meets his suffering with compassionate love rather than judgment, the meaning transforms entirely. The guilt that once isolated him now connects him to universal human experience. His anguish becomes the foundation for empathy rather than the justification for cruelty. Prince Mishkin embodies this transformation most completely, is less than #0. 5# is greater than his epilepsy, represents the vulnerability that makes genuine love possible. He cannot shield himself from others' pain, so he learns to transform it through compassion. Where others see his condition as weakness, Dostoevsky reveals it as spiritual strength. Mishkin's insight cuts to the heart of human existence. To be a human being among human beings and remain one forever, no matter what misfortunes befall, not to become depressed and not to falter. This is what life is. His suffering doesn't diminish his capacity for love, but deepens it, creating space for others' pain without being destroyed by it. Love emerges as the alchemical force that transmutes necessary suffering from meaningless torment into spiritual growth and deeper human connection. This transformation doesn't eliminate pain, Sonia still endures poverty, Mishkin still suffers seizures, Raskolnikov still carries the weight of his crime. Rather, love changes suffering's quality from destructive to creative, from isolating to connecting. When suffering is met with compassion rather than bitterness, it becomes the foundation for understanding others' pain. Suffering shared becomes empathy. Suffering accepted becomes wisdom. Suffering transformed becomes the basis for serving humanity. This understanding reveals love's true power, not as escape from human limitation, but as the force that gives meaning to inevitable pain. Through love, suffering becomes the very ground of spiritual development, creating capacity for compassion that would be impossible without the knowledge of pain. Such insights into suffering's transformation through love naturally extend beyond individual psychology into questions of how societies might embody these same principles of compassion and spiritual understanding. Part 6. The Critique of Revolutionary Ideology. Peter Verkovensky emerges from the pages of Demons as Dostoevsky's most chilling portrait of revolutionary psychology, not the noble rebel fighting tyranny, but the nihilist who destroys existing order without any genuine vision for improvement. His confession cuts to the heart of the matter. I'm a scoundrel, not a socialist. This brutal honesty reveals what Dostoevsky saw as the true nature of revolutionary fervor, the will to power disguised as concern for justice. Verkovensky enjoys destruction for its own sake rather than for any constructive purpose, finding in revolution the perfect outlet for his appetite for chaos and control. The psychological insight penetrates deeper than mere political critique. Revolutionary fervor, Dostoevsky demonstrates, often masks personal resentment and frustrated ambition rather than genuine concern for the oppressed. Verkovensky's genius lies in understanding how to exploit this psychological reality. He manipulates idealistic young people like Shatov and Kirillov, recognizing that their sincere desire for meaning and justice makes them perfect instruments for his destructive purposes. People desperate for meaning, he understands, will follow anyone who offers them a cause worth dying for. The revolutionary leader becomes a master psychologist, identifying the spiritual hunger in others and feeding it with promises of historical significance and moral purpose. This manipulation reveals the profound corruption at the heart of revolutionary movements. Verkovensky transforms genuine idealism into fanaticism by offering his followers what their souls crave, a sense of participating in something greater than themselves. Yet he provides this meaning through violence and destruction, corrupting the very idealism he exploits. The young revolutionaries believe they serve humanity, whilst actually serving Verkovensky's appetite for power and chaos. Shigalev's system provides the theoretical framework for this psychological analysis, revealing the totalitarian logic inherent in utopian thinking. His chilling formulation captures the inevitable trajectory, starting from unlimited freedom. I arrive at unlimited despotism. The mathematical precision of his proposal, dividing humanity into two unequal parts, 1/10 ruling over 9/10 reduced to slavery, exposes how rational planning applied to human society becomes irrational tyranny. Perfect equality, he demonstrates, can only be achieved through perfect inequality, with absolute power concentrated in the hands of those enlightened enough to organize the perfect society. This paradox illuminates Dostoevsky's prophetic insight into how revolutionary movements become corrupted by the means they employ, turning liberators into oppressors. The psychological mechanism operates with inexorable logic. Violence and deception, once accepted as necessary means, reshape the character of those who employ them. The revolutionary begins by wanting to serve humanity and ends by viewing humanity as raw material for his experiments. Compassion transforms into contempt as the revolutionary discovers that people resist the very improvements he seeks to impose upon them. The underground psychology emerges here in its political form. Just as the underground man resents others for failing to conform to his rational expectations, the revolutionary resents humanity for failing to embrace the rational society he designs for them. This resentment justifies increasingly harsh measures. If people will not accept freedom, they must be forced to be free. The revolutionary's love for humanity in the abstract becomes hatred for actual human beings in their stubborn particularity. Dostoevsky reveals how revolutionary ideology functions as a secular substitute for religion, promising salvation through political transformation rather than spiritual regeneration. Yet this substitute faith lacks the genuine transcendence that authentic religion provides, becoming instead a projection of human will to power onto the historical process. The revolutionary imagines himself as the agent of historical necessity, but this necessity turns out to be merely his own desire for control, dressed in the language of scientific inevitability. The Grand Inquisitor stands as more than Dostoevsky's indictment of institutional Christianity. He represents the archetypal figure of any system that promises to solve human problems through external organization rather than internal transformation. The socialist revolutionary, in Dostoevsky's analysis, appeals to precisely the same human needs as religion: the desperate hunger for meaning, community, justice, and salvation from suffering. The crucial difference lies not in the promise, but in its location, material transformation, rather than spiritual regeneration. This substitution reveals socialism's function as what Dostoevsky recognized as a false religion, complete with its own trinity of consolation. Where the Grand Inquisitor offers miracle, mystery, and authority to relieve humanity of the terrible burden of freedom, socialist ideology provides these same comforts in secular dress. The miracle becomes the promise of earthly paradise through scientific planning and rational organization. The mystery transforms into the historical dialectic that guarantees inevitable progress toward justice. The authority manifests as the party or state that alone comprehends the direction of history and can guide humanity toward its destined fulfillment. Ivan Karamazov grasps this essential similarity when he observes that socialism represents the question of the Tower of Babel, built without God, not to mount to heaven from earth, but to set up heaven on earth. The revolutionary seeks to accomplish through human effort what religion promises, through divine intervention, the elimination of suffering, the establishment of perfect justice, the creation of universal brotherhood. Yet this very ambition reveals socialism's religious character, its refusal to accept the permanent conditions of human existence in favor of a utopian transcendence. Dostoevsky's critique penetrates deeper than political disagreement to expose socialism's fundamental denial of individual moral responsibility in favor of social determinism. The revolutionary characters in Demons justify their most heinous crimes by appealing to historical necessity rather than personal choice. They become, like the masses under the Grand Inquisitor's care, products of their circumstances rather than moral agents capable of authentic decision. Class position determines consciousness. Economic relations shape character. Social structures create individual behavior. The burden of moral choice, that terrible freedom which Christ refuses to remove, dissolves into the comforting determinism of material forces. This escape from responsibility creates the same psychological relief that the Grand Inquisitor offers his flock. People need no longer struggle with the agonizing questions of right and wrong, good and evil, because these categories become functions of historical position rather than moral choice. The worker cannot be blamed for his resentment. The capitalist cannot help his exploitation. The revolutionary cannot be condemned for his violence. All become instruments of historical forces larger than individual will or conscience. Yet Dostoevsky recognizes that political solutions to spiritual problems inevitably become tyrannical precisely because they cannot address the real source of human unhappiness, the burden of consciousness itself, the weight of moral responsibility, the fundamental loneliness of individual existence. Socialist systems must therefore treat continued human dissatisfaction as false consciousness to be corrected rather than authentic spiritual need to be addressed. When the promised paradise fails to eliminate suffering, when material abundance cannot satisfy spiritual hunger, when social equality cannot resolve existential anxiety, the system must conclude that the problem lies not in its premises, but in the consciousness of those who remain unsatisfied. This psychological necessity creates the foundation for tyranny. Those who persist in spiritual seeking after the establishment of material justice become enemies of progress, obstacles to collective happiness, carriers of dangerous illusions that threaten social stability. The commitment to abstract ideals, equality, justice, progress, begins to justify concrete cruelty to actual human beings who fail to find fulfillment in these ideals. Revolutionary ideology possesses a peculiar magnetism that Dostoevsky understood better than perhaps any other writer of his generation. The promise is always the same: present violence justified by future harmony, temporary cruelty redeemed by permanent justice. Yet through his penetrating psychological analysis, Dostoevsky reveals how this seductive logic transforms those who embrace it in ways they never anticipated. The murder of Shatov in Demons provides the clearest illustration of this transformation. The conspirators who gathered to kill their former comrade began as idealistic reformers, genuinely convinced they were working toward human liberation. Yet when their organization faces exposure, they discover themselves capable of murdering a man who had once shared their dreams. The violence they believed would remain limited and instrumental, a surgical strike against oppression, becomes unlimited and expressive. They kill not because they must, but because they can, because the logic of revolution has already prepared them to view human life as expendable. This psychological corruption operates through a particular form of moral reasoning that Dostoevsky anatomizes with devastating precision. Raskolnikov's theory of extraordinary individuals reveals the essential structure of revolutionary thinking. Some people, he argues, have the natural right to transgress ordinary moral law when sufficiently important purposes are at stake. The parallel with revolutionary ideology is unmistakable. Certain individuals, blessed with superior understanding of historical necessity, acquire the right to sacrifice others for the greater good. What emerges from this reasoning is a profound abstraction of human value. The concept of humanity becomes more real than actual human beings. The revolutionary loves humanity in general, whilst despising human beings in particular. This abstraction permits extraordinary cruelty because the concrete person before you, with their fears, hopes, and irreducible individuality, dissolves into a mere obstacle to human progress. The peasant who resists collectivization, the bourgeois who clings to private property, the believer who refuses enlightenment, all become enemies of humanity itself. Raskolnikov's internal torment after his crime represents what happens to the revolutionary conscience once it accepts that murder can be justified. The psychological insight Dostoevsky offers is devastating. Violence always expands beyond its intended targets because it represents a fundamental rejection of human dignity. Once you have killed for the cause, you have crossed a threshold that can never be uncrossed. The person who kills for the revolution becomes capable of killing for the party, then for personal power, then from mere habit. This expansion of violence occurs not through external corruption, but through internal transformation. The revolutionary discovers that violence is not merely a tool to be picked up and discarded, but a spiritual poison that changes the very nature of those who employ it. Each act of justified cruelty makes the next act easier to justify. The conscience, once violated in service of the highest ideals, finds itself increasingly capable of violation in service of lower ones. Dostoevsky understood that this corruption operates independently of the revolutionary's initial motivations. The most sincere idealist and the most cynical opportunist end in the same place because the logic of revolutionary violence contains its own internal momentum. The person who begins by asking, "What must I sacrifice for human happiness?" ends by asking, "Who must I eliminate for my own security?" The transition feels natural, even inevitable, because the fundamental premise that some lives matter less than others remains constant. This insight creates the foundation for understanding Dostoevsky's alternative vision. If violence corrupts not merely through its external effects, but through its internal transformation of those who employ it, then genuine social transformation must proceed through spiritual rather than political revolution. The change must begin within the human heart, not within political institutions, because institutions reflect the spiritual condition of those who create and maintain them. Part 7. Russian Messianism and Spiritual Destiny. Dostoevsky envisioned Russia as occupying a unique position in world history, neither fully Western nor Eastern, but capable of synthesizing the essential truths of both whilst avoiding their fundamental errors. This geographical and spiritual positioning creates unprecedented possibilities for human development. Russia's centuries of experience with European rationalism and Asian mysticism, its Orthodox Christian heritage, and its particular history of suffering have forged a consciousness that transcends the limitations plaguing both Western materialism and Eastern withdrawal from worldly engagement. The critique of Western civilization emerges from Dostoevsky's direct encounters with European modernity during his travels. What he witnessed horrified him, not the technological achievements or political freedoms, but the spiritual emptiness disguised as progress. In Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, his observation of London captures this perfectly. What a powerful, what a great thing. You feel that here a great eternal thought has been achieved, but you also feel that this is the final word, that here is Baal, and you must accept and worship it. The West had created magnificent structures whilst losing the soul that gives them meaning. Individual freedom had become isolation, scientific rationalism had become spiritual blindness, and material prosperity had become the worship of false gods. Western individualism, for all its liberation from traditional constraints, had severed the organic connections between human beings that make genuine community possible. The emphasis on rights, contracts, and rational calculation had replaced the mystical bonds of love and shared spiritual purpose. Progress measured only in material terms inevitably leads to spiritual regression. The very success of Western civilization becomes its damnation. Russian Orthodoxy represents something fundamentally different from Western Christianity. Where Western Christianity had become either legalistic Catholicism or rationalized Protestantism, Orthodoxy maintained its mystical depth whilst remaining engaged with social reality. The Orthodox emphasis on theosis, the process of becoming divine through participation in God's nature, offers a vision of human possibility that transcends both Western humanism and Eastern detachment. This is not individual salvation, but communal transformation expressed through the concept of subornost spiritual community that unites persons whilst preserving their unique contributions to the whole. The Russian Christ differs profoundly from the Western Christ. He is simultaneously transcendent and immanent, both the cosmic principle governing reality and the intimate companion sharing human suffering. This Christ does not demand submission to external authority, but invites participation in divine life. He does not promise escape from the world, but transformation of it through love that encompasses all creation. This spiritual heritage creates psychological possibilities unavailable to purely Western or Eastern consciousness. Russians have experienced suffering in ways that Western optimism cannot comprehend, yet they have maintained hope in ways that Eastern resignation cannot achieve. Their historical experience of autocracy and freedom, of European influence and Asian mysticism, of Orthodox spirituality and secular modernization, has forged a consciousness capable of holding contradictions in creative tension rather than resolving them through false simplifications. Cultural identity shapes individual consciousness in ways that rational analysis alone cannot penetrate. Russians possess different spiritual possibilities than Westerners, precisely because their historical experience has created different psychological structures. The Russian soul has been formed through centuries of particular experiences that Western individualism and Eastern mysticism, taken separately, cannot replicate. This creates the foundation for Russia's unique spiritual mission to demonstrate that human beings can achieve both individual development and organic community, both rational understanding and mystical participation, both engagement with the world and transcendence of its limitations. Dostoevsky's vision of Christ emerges not from theological doctrine, but from the lived experience of a people shaped by suffering. The Russian Christ, as he understood it, bears little resemblance to the triumphant figure of Western Christianity, no crowned king dispensing justice from heavenly thrones, no institutional authority commanding earthly power. Instead, this Christ walks amongst the poorest, the most broken, carrying their burdens as his own. The Russian Christ is the Christ of the people, the Christ who suffers with the people. Dostoevsky wrote in his notebooks, capturing something essential about how Orthodox spirituality had shaped the Russian soul differently from its Western counterparts. This difference runs deeper than mere cultural preference. Where Western Christianity often presents Christ as the solution to suffering, the divine intervention that ends pain and establishes justice, the Russian Christ transforms suffering itself into a pathway to spiritual wisdom. Prince Myshkin embodies this understanding perfectly. His epilepsy, his childlike vulnerability, his inability to navigate the sophisticated cruelties of society, these apparent weaknesses become the very sources of his spiritual insight. Through his condition, Mishkin experiences moments of transcendent clarity that reveal the interconnectedness of all existence. His suffering doesn't diminish his spiritual authority, it creates it. This vision extends beyond individual spiritual experience into Dostoevsky's understanding of Russia's unique mission in world history. Russia, he believed, was called to demonstrate an alternative to the false choices dominating European thought, the materialism of capitalism and the atheism of socialism. Orthodox Christianity, lived authentically rather than merely professed institutionally, offered a third way that neither Western Christianity nor European secularism had discovered. Russia's greatness would emerge not through military conquest or economic dominance, but through spiritual example, showing the world how Christian love could transform social reality without becoming either otherworldly mysticism or this worldly politics. The Russian idea will be the synthesis of all those ideas which Europe has been developing in its various nationalities. Dostoevsky predicted envisioning Russia as the place where European civilization's fragmented insights would finally cohere into a unified spiritual vision. This wasn't nationalist exclusivism, but its opposite, the recognition that universal religious truth must be embodied in particular cultural forms rather than remaining abstract. The Russian Christ represented not a rejection of other spiritual traditions, but their fulfillment through the specific genius of a people whose historical experience of suffering had prepared them to understand Christianity's deepest mysteries. Yet this understanding creates its own tensions. How does particular cultural embodiment avoid becoming cultural supremacism? How does spiritual mission translate into concrete social transformation without corrupting itself through political power? These questions would drive Dostoevsky toward his most ambitious vision, the possibility of universal human brotherhood emerging through, rather than despite, the deep particularities of national spiritual traditions. Russian Messianism presents a profound paradox that distinguishes it from every other form of national exceptionalism. Dostoevsky's vision of Russia's spiritual destiny aims at universal human unity, not through conquest or conversion, but through the particular spiritual gifts that Russian suffering has cultivated. This nationalism transcends politics entirely. Russia's greatness lies not in dominating other nations, but in serving their deepest spiritual needs through example and sacrifice. The genius of this vision emerges in Dostoevsky's concept of sobornost, a form of spiritual community that offers a third way between Western individualism and socialist collectivism. Sobornost represents voluntary spiritual unity that preserves individual dignity whilst creating genuine community. When Elder Zosima teaches that each person bears responsibility for all others, he reveals how authentic connection emerges without coercion. This responsibility creates bonds stronger than legal contracts or revolutionary solidarity because it springs from love rather than ideology or self-interest. Dostoevsky believed Russia would lead humanity toward genuine brotherhood based on Orthodox Christian principles of love, forgiveness, and spiritual transformation. In his famous Pushkin speech, he declared, "The Russian soul, the genius of the Russian people, is perhaps most capable of embracing the idea of universal unity of mankind. This capacity stems not from Russian superiority, but from Russia's unique ability to understand and love other cultures rather than dominating them." The Russian spirit, shaped by Orthodox Christianity and historical suffering, possesses what Dostoevsky saw as an extraordinary gift for empathy and spiritual comprehension. This messianic vision culminates in the recognition that Russia's historical suffering has prepared it to understand and heal the spiritual wounds of modern civilization. The centuries of oppression, the deep orthodox spirituality, and Russia's position between East and West create unprecedented possibilities for a new form of human community. This community would be based on spiritual rather than political or economic principles, a brotherhood emerging from transformed hearts rather than reformed institutions. The underground prophets of this vision understand that Russia's destiny involves becoming the servant of humanity's spiritual needs. They recognize that true Messianism requires self-sacrifice rather than self-aggrandizement, that leading means serving, and that Russia's greatest contribution to world history will be demonstrating how genuine human community becomes possible through spiritual transformation rather than political revolution. Part 8. Death, Immortality, and Ultimate Meaning. Ippolit Terentiev lies dying in The Idiot, and through his desperate confession, Dostoevsky delivers perhaps his most uncompromising examination of death as the fundamental absurdity that renders all human striving meaningless. This 18-year-old consumptive, facing certain death within months, articulates what healthy people spend their lives avoiding: the ultimate futility of finite existence. What's the good of living for 6 months? He cries out in anguished bewilderment. What's the use of dying well when one has not lived well? His terminal illness strips away every comfortable illusion, forcing him to confront the raw fact that death makes mockery of all human projects, all hopes, all attempts at significance. Ippolit's confession reveals Dostoevsky's profound psychological insight. Awareness of mortality creates the specifically human forms of anxiety and despair that distinguish us from every other creature. Animals die without knowing they will die. They suffer, but they do not suffer from the knowledge of their own finitude. Humans alone carry the burden of consciousness that transforms every moment into a confrontation with ending. Dostoevsky understood this with particular intensity, shaped by his own brush with execution before the firing squad, where he experienced those final moments when death becomes absolutely real rather than abstract possibility. That experience taught him how consciousness of mortality transforms every subsequent moment of life, making each experience simultaneously more precious and more futile. The knowledge of death creates what Dostoevsky recognized as the fundamental human condition. We are the only beings who must create meaning whilst knowing that meaning will be extinguished. This awareness generates the peculiar torment of human existence. We cannot live unconsciously like animals, yet consciousness brings the unbearable knowledge of our own termination. Every achievement becomes shadowed by its impermanence, every love haunted by separation, every moment of joy undermined by the certainty of its ending. Kirillov in Demons represents the logical endpoint of this confrontation with mortality under atheistic assumptions. His planned suicide emerges not from despair, but from philosophical necessity. If there is no immortality, then life itself becomes unbearable for the fully conscious person. If there is no God, then I am God, he reasons with terrifying logic. But if I am God, then I am bound to show my self-will. His suicide becomes the ultimate assertion of human freedom against the tyranny of mortality, the one act that demonstrates complete autonomy over existence itself. Kirillov's reasoning exposes the philosophical crisis that mortality creates for atheistic worldviews. If consciousness ends at death, then human existence becomes a cosmic joke, beings capable of conceiving eternity trapped in finite bodies, minds that can imagine infinite possibilities confined to brief decades. The atheist must either live in constant bad faith, pretending that mortality doesn't negate meaning, or face the logical conclusion that conscious existence under such conditions becomes unbearable. Death thus becomes Dostoevsky's test case for all philosophical systems. Their validity depends entirely on their ability to provide genuine meaning in the face of mortality. Rationalist optimism collapses when confronted with the reality that all rational progress ends in death. Romantic individualism crumbles when the individual discovers that self-realization terminates in annihilation. Every secular philosophy that promises meaning whilst accepting mortality ultimately offers only sophisticated forms of distraction from the fundamental absurdity. This creates what Dostoevsky saw as the central philosophical necessity, exploring whether belief in immortality represents optional comfort for the weak-minded or the necessary foundation for any meaningful existence whatsoever. The terror of mortality forces the ultimate question: can finite beings create genuine significance, or does meaning require the possibility of infinite extension? Through characters like Hippolyte and Kirillov, Dostoevsky suggests that honest confrontation with death reveals the inadequacy of every philosophy that attempts to ground meaning in mortal existence alone. The underground man's tormented consciousness reveals a truth that extends far beyond his particular neuroses. The human demand for moral meaning cannot be satisfied within the boundaries of finite existence. Dostoevsky understood that the question of immortality is not about personal comfort or wishful thinking, but about the very possibility of moral responsibility itself. Through Ivan Karamazov's devastating insight, he articulates what becomes the cornerstone of his moral philosophy. If there's no immortality of the soul, then there's no virtue, and everything is lawful. This is not the desperate plea of someone afraid to die, but a rigorous philosophical argument about the foundations of ethics. Ivan recognizes that moral distinctions require more than social convention or personal preference to maintain their authority over human consciousness. If both saint and sinner dissolve into the same material nothingness, what objective basis exists for preferring sainthood to sin? The utilitarian might invoke social benefit, but this merely pushes the question back: why should we care about society's welfare if society itself is merely a temporary arrangement of matter destined for cosmic extinction? The profound psychological insight emerges through characters like Raskolnikov, whose torment stems not simply from having committed murder, but from the possibility that his guilt itself might be meaningless. His underground consciousness cannot escape the demand for ultimate justice and meaning, yet it finds no adequate foundation for these demands within materialist assumptions about reality. The axe falls, the blood flows, the old woman dies. But if these events occur within a purely material universe, what transforms them from mere rearrangements of atoms into moral catastrophes that demand eternal accountability? Dostoevsky's characters discover that finite existence cannot justify infinite moral demands. The call to love, to justice, to truth carries within itself an absoluteness that exceeds any finite framework. We do not love conditionally upon receiving adequate compensation, nor do we pursue justice only when it proves practically beneficial. The moral consciousness makes unconditional demands that presuppose a reality capable of validating such absoluteness, a reality that transcends the boundaries of material existence. This understanding reveals immortality not as reward for good behavior, but as the metaphysical condition that makes good behavior meaningful rather than arbitrary. The saint and the murderer must face different ultimate destinies, not because goodness deserves compensation, but because moral choices must have ultimate significance for moral responsibility to exist at all. Without this eternal dimension, moral distinctions collapse into matters of taste or temporary social utility. The psychological necessity becomes clear through the underground consciousness itself, that peculiar form of awareness that cannot rest satisfied with materialist explanations of its own moral demands. Characters throughout Dostoevsky's novels are driven to desperation not by external circumstances alone, but by the contradiction between their inescapable moral consciousness and their intellectual acceptance of materialist premises. They cannot stop caring about ultimate justice and meaning, yet they can find no adequate foundation for such caring within the finite world. This creates what Dostoevsky sees as the central crisis of modern consciousness, the retention of moral sensibilities within worldviews that cannot support them. The underground man's spite and contradiction stem from his recognition that his moral demands exceed what his rational worldview can justify. He cannot abandon these demands, yet he cannot validate them either. The result is a consciousness at war with itself, demanding what it believes impossible. The argument extends beyond individual psychology to the very structure of moral reasoning itself. If moral principles are merely human constructions with no eternal validation, they lose their authority to override immediate desires and interess. Why should I refrain from murder if murder serves my purposes and I can avoid punishment? The story of Lazarus haunted Dostoevsky throughout his career, becoming his central metaphor for the possibility that defines human existence. Death followed by new life, not mere continuation of old life. When Sonia reads this biblical account to Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, she reveals something profound about the nature of spiritual transformation. Resurrection represents not just personal survival, but fundamental transformation of consciousness and identity. The resurrected person is the same yet completely different recognizably themselves, yet possessing an entirely new mode of being. This transformation operates not merely as future hope, but as present possibility. Dostoevsky understood that people can experience spiritual death and rebirth within earthly life itself. Raskolnikov's journey illustrates this perfectly. His crime represents spiritual death, the complete severing of himself from human community and moral reality. His acceptance of Sonia's love represents resurrection into new life, not a return to his previous state, but emergence into a fundamentally different way of existing. The transformation is psychological and spiritual, occurring within the structures of ordinary human experience, yet transcending them completely. For Dostoevsky, immortality is not mere duration, but qualitative transformation, becoming capable of eternal love and meaning, rather than simply existing forever. Zosima teaches that love makes us capable of eternal life because love itself is eternal. The person who learns to love authentically has already begun to participate in immortal reality. This insight revolutionizes the entire question of death and survival. Immortality becomes not the preservation of our current selves indefinitely, but the transformation of consciousness into something capable of eternal significance. Resurrection represents the completion of human development, the fulfillment of consciousness in perfect love and understanding, rather than the preservation of current limitations forever. Dostoevsky's characters who experience this transformation discover that their individual identity becomes more, not less, authentic through this process. They become fully themselves precisely by transcending their previous boundaries. This vision of immortality as transformation rather than mere survival provides the foundation for understanding how Dostoevsky integrates psychological insight with spiritual vision. The underground consciousness that begins in rebellion and isolation can complete itself in resurrection and eternal communion. Death becomes not the enemy of meaning, but its ultimate revealer, showing what in human life possesses genuine permanence and what must be transformed or abandoned. Part 9. The integration of psychology and spirituality. Dostoevsky possessed an almost uncanny ability to map the hidden territories of human consciousness decades before Freud would systematically explore the unconscious mind. Yet whilst modern psychology would discover the unconscious as a realm of repressed desires and forgotten traumas, Dostoevsky understood it as something far more complex, a space where psychological truth and spiritual revelation interweave in ways that neither pure materialism nor naive spirituality could fully grasp. Consider Raskolnikov's haunting childhood dream of the beaten horse, a sequence that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The dream emerges from deep psychological wounds, the trauma of witnessing cruelty, the formation of his compassionate yet tormented nature. Modern psychology would correctly identify this as unconscious material surfacing to reveal formative experiences that shaped his moral sensibility. But Dostoevsky presents the dream as equally revelatory in spiritual terms. The child's anguish over the horse's suffering becomes a window into the sacred dimension of compassion, a glimpse of the divine spark that makes murder ultimately impossible for someone of Raskolnikov's nature. The same unconscious material that reveals psychological causation simultaneously unveils spiritual truth. This dual nature of unconscious experience appears throughout Dostoevsky's work with remarkable consistency. Svidrigailov's ghostly visitations in Crime and Punishment exemplify this integration perfectly. From a psychological perspective, these apparitions clearly stem from guilt, deteriorating mental health, and approaching suicide. The ghosts manifest his psychological disintegration in vivid, concrete form. Yet Dostoevsky refuses to reduce these experiences to mere symptoms. The ghosts carry genuine spiritual weight. They represent the actual presence of those he has wronged, the reality of moral consequence that transcends physical death. What appears to be mental illness simultaneously functions as spiritual perception of normally hidden realities. Ivan Karamazov's encounter with the devil provides perhaps the most sophisticated example of this psychological spiritual integration. The devil appears during Ivan's brain fever, clearly a hallucination produced by physical and mental exhaustion. Ivan himself recognizes this, dismissing his visitor as a product of his fevered mind. Yet the conversation that unfolds reveals truths about evil, suffering, and the human condition that transcend mere psychological projection. The devil articulates philosophical positions that Ivan has been wrestling with, but with a clarity and cynicism that forces Ivan to confront the ultimate implications of his own thinking. The experience is simultaneously hallucinatory and revelatory, psychologically determined and spiritually meaningful. Dostoevsky's genius lies in demonstrating that psychological and spiritual explanations enhance rather than contradict each other. The unconscious mind becomes a meeting ground where material causation and spiritual significance converge. Dreams reveal both repressed memories and prophetic insights. Mental illness can manifest genuine spiritual perception alongside genuine dysfunction. This integration suggests that human consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously, with psychological and spiritual dimensions interpenetrating rather than competing. This understanding creates profound implications for healing and transformation. Characters like Raskolnikov cannot achieve genuine recovery through psychological analysis alone, no matter how penetrating. His guilt, isolation, and suffering have psychological roots that could theoretically be addressed through understanding his childhood trauma, social circumstances, and mental patterns. But Dostoevsky shows that such psychological healing remains incomplete without spiritual transformation, the recognition of love, the acceptance of grace, the restoration of connection to something greater than the isolated ego. The integration works in reverse as well. Spiritual transformation manifests in concrete psychological changes. When Raskolnikov finally accepts Sonia's love and faith, his psychological symptoms begin to resolve. The paranoia diminishes, the isolation breaks down, the capacity for joy returns. Dostoevsky's holy characters emerge not as paragons of conventional mental health, but as figures whose spiritual insight springs precisely from their psychological extremity. Prince Mishkin's epilepsy becomes the very source of his penetrating vision into human nature. His seizures, those moments when ordinary consciousness dissolves, grants him access to a reality that eludes the psychologically normal. The medical establishment would classify him as mentally ill, yet his idiocy reveals itself as a form of wisdom that sees through social pretense to the essential dignity of every human soul. This paradox runs throughout Dostoevsky's spiritual psychology. Alyosha Karamazov, the novice monk whom many regard as Dostoevsky's most saintly character, possesses a spiritual sensitivity that makes him more acutely aware of evil and suffering, not less. His holiness consists not in naive innocence, but in the remarkable capacity to encounter the full spectrum of human darkness without being corrupted by it. He walks through the moral chaos of his family's dysfunction, witnessing his father's debauchery and his brother Ivan's tortured atheism, yet emerges with his compassion intact and even deepened. The intensity that characterizes Dostoevsky's saints mirrors that of his sinners. Both inhabit the extremes of human possibility rather than the comfortable middle ground of conventional respectability. Raskolnikov's psychological torment after his crime operates at the same pitch of intensity as Father Zosima's mystical experiences. The difference lies not in the degree of their psychological engagement, but in how they channel that intensity. The criminal's obsession destroys whilst the saint transforms. Mental illness becomes, in Dostoevsky's vision, the occasion for potential spiritual breakthrough rather than merely pathology to be cured. The underground man's psychological fragmentation could lead either to complete nihilistic dissolution or to the recognition of his need for redemption. Kirillov's suicidal mania in The Possessed contains within it a genuine spiritual insight about the nature of divine freedom, though he pursues it to a destructive conclusion. The same psychological conditions that precipitate spiritual crisis also create the possibility for transcendence. This understanding revolutionizes how we conceive spiritual development. Rather than requiring psychological simplicity or the elimination of inner conflict, authentic holiness demands the integration of all aspects of human nature, including its most difficult and disturbing elements. The saint is not the person who has no psychological struggles, but the one who has learned to transform struggle into compassion and wisdom. Zosima's teachings emerge not from a life of serene contemplation, but from his earlier experience as a dissolute young officer who nearly fought a duel before his spiritual awakening. Dostoevsky's psychological realism reveals that spiritual transformation manifests as practical psychological change rather than ethereal transcendence. His holy characters display genuine psychological complexity precisely because they have engaged with, rather than avoided, the full range of human experience. Their spiritual authority derives from having descended into the depths of psychological extremity and emerged with their capacity for love not only intact, but purified and strengthened. Dostoevsky understood redemption not as divine forgiveness granted from above, but as genuine psychological transformation emerging from within. Through Raskolnikov's tortured journey in Crime and Punishment, he demonstrates that spiritual healing requires far more than acknowledgement of wrongdoing or acceptance of punishment. True redemption demands the courage to face one's deepest darkness, accept full responsibility for one's choices, and commit to fundamentally different ways of being in the world. Raskolnikov's transformation begins not with his confession to the police, but with his recognition that his suffering stems from his own psychological fragmentation. His crime has split him from himself, from others, and from any sense of meaning beyond his own will to power. The path to healing requires him to acknowledge not merely that he committed murder, but that his entire philosophical framework, his belief in his own superiority, his contempt for ordinary moral constraints, has poisoned his capacity for genuine human connection. This process mirrors what Dostoevsky saw as essential to all authentic therapeutic transformation: the willingness to surrender the defensive structures that protect the ego while simultaneously cutting us off from life itself. Raskolnikov must abandon his rationalizations, his pride, and his desperate need to prove himself exceptional. Only through this surrender can he begin to experience what Dostoevsky understood as the fundamental healing force: love that accepts the person whilst refusing to excuse the destructive behavior. Sonia's love for Raskolnikov becomes therapeutically powerful precisely because it offers no easy comfort. She does not tell him his crime was understandable or that his suffering absolves him. Instead, she offers him something far more challenging and ultimately more healing: the possibility of serving something greater than his own tormented self-consciousness. Her love creates space for his transformation, not by removing his guilt, but by showing him how that guilt can become the foundation for a different kind of life. Through this relationship, Dostoevsky reveals the therapeutic process as requiring three essential elements: the courage to face one's own darkness without flinching, the humility to accept help from others, and the commitment to serve something beyond oneself. These elements work together to create what he saw as the only genuine resolution to psychological suffering: the transformation of self-preoccupation into self-transcendence. The psychological symptoms of spiritual transformation manifest clearly in Dostoevsky's characters who achieve breakthrough. Their anxiety decreases, not because their circumstances improve, but because they accept their mortality and limitations. Their capacity for love increases as their desperate self-preoccupation diminishes. They find peace not through gaining control over their lives, but through accepting uncertainty whilst committing themselves to values that transcend their personal comfort. This integration reveals Dostoevsky's profound insight. Psychology without spirituality remains trapped in the very self-focus that creates suffering, while spirituality without psychological understanding becomes abstract and ineffective. His genius lies in demonstrating how the deepest psychological healing requires spiritual transformation, whilst authentic spiritual development must manifest in psychological health and genuine relational capacity. This unified vision creates the foundation for understanding his prophetic diagnosis of modern civilization's spiritual crisis and its potential renewal through rediscovered human connection. Part 10. The Prophetic Vision. The Grand Inquisitor stands before Christ in Dostoevsky's parable, explaining with chilling precision how humanity must be governed. "We have corrected thy work," he declares, outlining a system of control based on miracle, mystery, and authority. What makes this scene from the brothers Karamazov so unsettling is not merely its theological implications, but its uncanny anticipation of the totalitarian machinery that would emerge decades later. Dostoevsky had glimpsed the future with prophetic clarity, understanding exactly how absolute power would operate in the modern world. The Inquisitor's program reads like a blueprint for 20th century totalitarianism. Miracle, the regime's spectacular displays of power, its mass rallies and impossible achievements that overwhelm rational criticism. Mystery, the impenetrable ideology that explains everything whilst remaining fundamentally incomprehensible, demanding faith rather than understanding. Authority, the absolute submission to the leader who bears the terrible burden of decision for the masses. Every totalitarian movement would follow this template precisely, from Stalin's cult of personality to Hitler's Nuremberg spectacles. In Demons, Dostoevsky provides the mathematical precision behind such systems through Shigalev's chilling calculation. Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism, Shigalev announces to the revolutionary circle. His system divides humanity into two unequal parts: 1/10 who possess absolute freedom, and 9/10 who surrender all individuality to become like a herd. This is not mere political theory, but a precise anticipation of how totalitarian regimes would operate. A small elite exercising complete control over masses reduced to interchangeable units. The psychological mechanism proves even more prophetic than the structural analysis. Dostoevsky understood that totalitarianism would succeed not through force alone, but through humanity's willingness to surrender freedom for security. The characters in Demons eagerly submit to Peter Verkovensky's manipulation, despite recognizing his obvious deceptions. They want to be controlled, to escape the burden of individual responsibility. The Grand Inquisitor makes this explicit. People cannot bear the fearful burden of free choice and will gratefully surrender it to anyone who promises certainty. This surrender emerges from spiritual crisis rather than political circumstance. Dostoevsky recognized that totalitarianism would arise not from external conquest, but from internal collapse, the loss of transcendent meaning, creating a vacuum that political ideologies would rush to fill. The revolutionary characters represent not merely political radicals, but spiritual seekers who have lost their way. Having rejected God, they desperately need something absolute to worship, making them perfect subjects for totalitarian solutions. The underground man's rebellion against the Crystal Palace takes on new significance in this context. That transparent structure of rational perfection becomes the prototype for every utopian scheme that would follow the perfectly ordered society where individual desire becomes impossible. Dostoevsky saw that such systems would inevitably require total surveillance and control, anticipating the panopticon state with remarkable precision. His prediction extends disturbingly into our contemporary moment. The Crystal Palace becomes the smart city, monitored and managed through algorithmic precision. Shigalev's system becomes social credit scoring and behavioral modification through digital platforms. The Grand Inquisitor's authority becomes the therapeutic state that manages citizens for their own psychological well-being, removing the burden of difficult choices. The mechanisms change, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical. The surrender of freedom for security, dressed in the language of care and efficiency. Dostoevsky understood that the greatest threat to human dignity would come not from obvious tyranny, but from systems that promise to solve the problem of human suffering by eliminating human agency itself. The Grand Inquisitor offers bread, spectacle, and certainty, everything except the terrible freedom that makes us human. His prophecy proves endlessly relevant because it grasps the permanent temptation to escape the burden of consciousness itself. Dostoevsky possessed an almost supernatural ability to peer into the future of human consciousness. Writing in the 19th century, he diagnosed spiritual ailments that would not fully manifest until the prosperous societies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The underground man's peculiar suffering material comfort, coupled with profound spiritual emptiness, reads today not as literary exaggeration, but as clinical description of modern life. The underground man enjoys every advantage rational humanism promises: education, leisure, freedom from physical want, liberation from traditional authorities, yet he experiences existence as unbearable consciousness, trapped in cycles of spite and self-loathing. His famous declaration that he would rather act against his own interests than submit to rational calculation anticipates a century of human behavior that confounds utilitarian predictions. Dostoevsky understood that consciousness itself becomes pathological when severed from transcendent meaning. This insight proves devastatingly prescient. Contemporary societies with the highest living standards report the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. The very conditions that should produce happiness, according to secular humanism, material prosperity, individual freedom, scientific progress, correlate with spiritual crisis. The underground man's disease has become epidemic precisely where his circumstances have become commonplace. Ivan Karamazov's intellectual rebellion against God provides the philosophical architecture for this crisis. His moral objections to divine providence, the suffering of innocent children, the apparent injustice of existence become the moral objections to existence itself when no divine solution remains available. Ivan's tragedy lies not in his reasoning, which is impeccable, but in his moral sensitivity. The same ethical intuitions that lead him away from traditional religion create demands that secular philosophy cannot satisfy. This psychological insight illuminates contemporary moral discourse. Human rights advocacy, bioethical concerns, environmental activism all reflect Ivan's fundamental conviction that human life possesses inherent dignity and meaning. Yet secular humanism struggles to provide rational foundation for these convictions. If humans are merely complex biological machines produced by evolutionary accident, why should human life be sacred? If consciousness is merely brain activity, what makes human experience meaningful rather than simply interesting? These questions echo Ivan's ultimate challenge. Without God, everything is permitted. Not because religious authority prevents wrongdoing, but because transcendent grounding provides the only coherent basis for moral obligation. Secular societies attempt to maintain Christian moral intuitions whilst abandoning Christian metaphysical foundations, a project Ivan demonstrates to be ultimately incoherent. Contemporary debates about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and human enhancement reveal the practical consequences of this incoherence. If human dignity derives from rational capacity, enhanced machines might possess greater dignity than humans. If moral worth depends on sentience, some animals might deserve greater protection than some humans. These implications follow logically from secular premises, yet violate moral intuitions that secular thinkers cannot abandon without destroying their own projects. Dostoevsky recognized that this crisis would intensify as material conditions improved. The underground man's consciousness becomes pathological precisely because external pressures no longer distract from internal emptiness. Prosperity creates space for the fundamental questions that traditional societies suppress through necessity. Why exist? What justifies suffering? How should we live? Secular humanism offers no compelling answers because it cannot acknowledge the transcendent dimension these questions require. The result is the peculiar modern phenomenon of existential crisis amid abundance, Ivan's rebellion universalized. Societies that have solved material problems discover that material solutions cannot address spiritual problems. The success of secular humanism in creating comfortable conditions for human life reveals its failure to provide reasons why human life matters. Dostoevsky's critique of institutional Christianity penetrates to the heart of modern spiritual crisis. His Grand Inquisitor reveals how religious institutions can become the very enemies of the spiritual experience they claim to preserve. The Inquisitor's Church offers miracle, mystery, and authority precisely because it fears the radical freedom that genuine spiritual encounter demands. This critique anticipates the contemporary exodus from organized religion by people who find spiritual hunger unmet by institutional orthodoxy, yet cannot embrace purely secular alternatives. The underground man's rejection of rational materialism emerges from spiritual need rather than mere intellectual dissatisfaction. His famous declaration that twice 2 is 4 represents the death of wonder suggests that purely scientific worldviews, however accurate, cannot address the human requirement for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Dostoevsky recognizes that psychological healing without spiritual transformation remains fundamentally incomplete. His character's mental anguish stems from existential rather than merely clinical sources. This integration of psychological and spiritual insight prefigures therapeutic approaches that address questions of meaning alongside symptom management. Raskolnikov's recovery requires not just guilt resolution, but complete transformation of consciousness. His healing comes through love, suffering, and spiritual awakening rather than rational understanding alone. This suggests that authentic mental health involves confronting ultimate questions about existence, morality, and transcendence. Dostoevsky's vision of universal brotherhood through particular spiritual commitment offers an alternative to both religious fundamentalism and secular materialism. His Russian Christ represents deep spiritual devotion that remains open to other traditions rather than rejecting them. This anticipates contemporary attempts to find spiritual depth without spiritual exclusivism. Alyosha's monastery training prepares him for engagement with the world rather than withdrawal from it. The prophetic significance lies in Dostoevsky's recognition that modernity's crisis is fundamentally spiritual rather than political or technological. Social reform without transformation of consciousness merely rearranges external conditions whilst leaving the essential human predicament untouched. His characters discover that authentic spirituality must emerge through intellectual sophistication, psychological insight, and moral complexity rather than despite them. This understanding of spirituality as mature response to modern consciousness rather than escape from it transforms how we approach the relationship between faith and reason, tradition, innovation, particular commitment, and universal openness. Part 11, the artistic method as philosophy. Dostoevsky's revolutionary artistic method embodies a profound philosophical conviction. Truth emerges through dialogue, not monologue. His polyphonic technique allows characters like Ivan Karamazov, Raskolnikov, and the Grand Inquisitor to speak with their own voices, expressing complete worldviews with full intellectual and emotional power. These figures never serve as mere mouthpieces for predetermined conclusions. Instead, each represents a coherent response to existence that demands serious consideration on its own terms. This approach reflects Dostoevsky's understanding that complex truth requires multiple perspectives whilst maintaining unwavering commitment to ultimate truth itself. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan's atheistic rebellion against God's world stands alongside Dmitri's passionate sensualism and Alyosha's gentle faith as equally compelling responses to the human condition. Each brother articulates a complete philosophy of life, developed through genuine struggle with fundamental questions about suffering, meaning, and responsibility. Yet the novel as a whole suggests that some responses prove more adequate than others, without simply dismissing the alternatives. Ivan's intellectual revolt against divine justice receives full hearing. His arguments about innocent suffering achieve devastating force, precisely because Dostoevsky presents them without authorial interference. The Grand Inquisitor's critique of Christ's impossible demands on human nature unfolds with such compelling logic that readers often find themselves persuaded by his position. This artistic honesty serves truth rather than undermining it. The polyphonic method anticipates postmodern recognition of multiple perspectives whilst avoiding postmodern relativism entirely. Dostoevsky demonstrates that truth possesses genuine complexity, requiring approach from multiple angles, but this complexity serves truth's discovery rather than its denial. Different perspectives illuminate different facets of reality without fragmenting reality itself into incompatible versions. Underground voices reveal aspects of human experience that surface rationality cannot capture. The underground man's contradictory monologue exposes the inadequacy of purely logical approaches to consciousness. His simultaneous self-hatred and self-justification, his rebellion against mathematical certainty, and his craving for recognition emerge through artistic dialogue between conflicting impulses within a single tormented psyche. This technique becomes philosophical method because simple answers to ultimate questions prove necessarily false. They cannot encompass the full reality of human experience. Rational analysis alone fails to convey how consciousness actually operates, how moral decisions emerge from the depths of personality, how faith and doubt intertwine in the believing soul. Artistic method captures these complexities through dramatic presentation rather than abstract argument. The underground consciousness speaks truths that systematic philosophy cannot articulate. When Raskolnikov theorizes about extraordinary individuals transcending moral law, his rational framework crumbles under the weight of actual murder. The artistic presentation of his psychological disintegration reveals more about moral reality than any theoretical discussion of ethics could achieve. His fevered dreams, his compulsive returns to the scene, his simultaneous desire for confession and concealment, these dramatic elements constitute philosophical argument through lived experience. Dostoevsky's polyphonic approach thus establishes artistic method as philosophical method, creating foundation for exploring how narrative techniques capture consciousness in ways that rational analysis cannot convey. The underground man speaks, and immediately we inhabit a consciousness at war with itself. Dostoevsky's confessional first-person narrative captures something that rational analysis cannot convey: the self-contradictory nature of consciousness itself. When the underground man declares, "I am a sick man, I am a spiteful man," he reveals the split between what he thinks and what he actually thinks, between his conscious intentions and his unconscious motivations. The reader experiences these contradictions rather than simply understanding them intellectually. This is not merely literary technique, but philosophical method. The underground man's voice demonstrates how self-deception operates, even in moments of apparent self-revelation. His rambling, contradictory confession puts us inside the experience of underground consciousness, making us feel its claustrophobia and desperation. We witness how he simultaneously craves human connection and destroys every opportunity for it, how he despises his own spitefulness whilst clinging to it as his only source of identity. Dostoevsky employs this unreliable narrator technique throughout his major works to show how consciousness actually functions. Raskolnikov's internal monologues reveal his extraordinary capacity for self-justification and rationalization, even as he confesses his crime. The narrative voice becomes a demonstration of how consciousness works rather than a report about how it works. We experience Raskolnikov's ability to convince himself that his motives are noble, while simultaneously recognizing the self-serving nature of his reasoning. This artistic innovation serves as philosophical investigation, a form of phenomenological exploration that reveals the structure of experience from within. The underground narrative voice allows readers to inhabit psychological processes that Dostoevsky analyzes rather than merely understanding them conceptually. When the underground man obsesses over a perceived slight from an officer who doesn't even notice him, we feel the corrosive power of resentment, the way it feeds on itself and transforms every interaction into confirmation of one's own worthlessness. The technique creates empathy and understanding that purely analytical description could never achieve. We don't simply learn about the psychology of resentment, we experience its claustrophobic intensity. The underground man's voice becomes a mirror in which we recognize our own capacity for self-deception, our own tendency to rationalize our failures and blame others for our misery. This recognition creates the foundation for genuine moral insight, not through abstract reasoning, but through the shock of self-recognition. Dostoevsky's underground prophets speak truths that emerge from the depths of consciousness itself, truths that rational discourse cannot reach, because they concern the very structure of rationality's limitations. Their voices prepare us to understand how his symbolic realism integrates material and spiritual dimensions of reality into a unified vision of human existence. Dostoevsky's artistic method operates through what can only be called symbolic realism, a technique that makes ordinary objects, settings, and events function simultaneously as credible, realistic details and profound spiritual symbols without sacrificing psychological authenticity. When Raskolnikov grips his axe in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky presents both the specific weight of metal in a murderer's hand and the symbolic weight of rational violence striking against spiritual reality. The axe remains utterly real. Its heft, its edge, its terrible practicality, whilst becoming transparent to deeper meaning. Similarly, Sonia's cramped, angular room exists as authentic poverty, complete with specific furnishings and oppressive dimensions, yet functions as sacred space where redemption unfolds. The Lazarus story operates both as actual biblical text that Sonia reads aloud and as psychological catalyst that awakens Raskolnikov's buried conscience. This technique reflects Dostoevsky's philosophical conviction that material and spiritual reality interpenetrate rather than existing as separate realms. The symbolic dimension doesn't replace or diminish the realistic dimension, but reveals its deeper significance. Dostoevsky demonstrates how ordinary objects and events can become transparent to spiritual meaning without ceasing to be ordinary. A tavern remains a tavern with its particular smells, sounds, and social dynamics, while serving as the space where souls encounter their deepest truths. A child's suffering retains its specific, unbearable reality, whilst becoming the focal point for ultimate questions about divine justice. This method allows Dostoevsky to explore ultimate questions through concrete human experience rather than abstract philosophical speculation. The theological problem of evil becomes Ivan Karamazov's specific catalogue of documented child abuse, complete with names, dates, and horrifying details that resist philosophical consolation. The philosophical problem of freedom becomes Raskolnikov's particular crime with its precise planning, execution, and psychological aftermath. The spiritual problem of faith becomes Alyosha's concrete response to his elder's death and the scandal of bodily corruption. Abstract ideas transform into lived realities that demand not theoretical resolution, but existential response. Dostoevsky's symbolic realism creates a form of artistic truth that encompasses both psychological accuracy and spiritual insight. His characters possess the full complexity of real people, their contradictions, their unconscious motivations, their capacity for self-deception, whilst embodying spiritual principles and moral possibilities. Dmitry Karamazov's sensuality remains psychologically credible in all its specific manifestations, whilst representing the spiritual struggle between earthly and divine love. This integration suggests that the deepest realism must include spiritual dimensions of experience, whilst authentic spirituality must manifest in psychological and social reality. Part 12. The Ethics of Extremity. Dostoevsky's moral philosophy emerges most powerfully through characters thrust into situations where conventional ethical systems collapse entirely. Raskolnikov's dilemma in Crime and Punishment crystallizes this perfectly. A brilliant young man facing poverty that threatens his family's future, surrounded by suffering. He might alleviate through a single act of violence against a wealthy pawnbroker who exploits the desperate. Here, utilitarian calculation suggests the crime could produce greater happiness. Deontological duty offers conflicting imperatives about murder versus family obligation, and virtue ethics provides no clear guidance for unprecedented circumstances. The conventional moral frameworks that govern ordinary life prove inadequate when pushed to their limits. This inadequacy reveals something profound about the nature of moral choice itself. When Raskolnikov commits his crime, he discovers that the philosophical justifications he constructed beforehand crumble under the weight of actual deed. The murder forces him into direct confrontation with questions about human dignity and the source of moral obligation that his rational theories had obscured. His subsequent torment demonstrates that genuine morality operates at a level deeper than social convention or philosophical system. It emerges from fundamental convictions about human worth that cannot be reasoned away or calculated around. Dmitry Karamazov's situation illuminates this principle from another angle. His willingness to accept punishment for patricide he didn't commit represents moral responsibility that transcends legal guilt entirely. Dmitry recognizes that whilst he may not have murdered his father physically, his hatred and wishes contributed to the moral atmosphere that made the crime possible. His acceptance of suffering reveals moral dimensions that law cannot capture, the recognition that responsibility extends beyond direct causation to encompass the intentions, desires, and spiritual posture that shape human relationships. This choice moves far beyond conventional notions of justice towards something approaching moral truth. The extremity of these situations serves a crucial philosophical function. Crisis strips away the social supports, conventional guidelines, and comfortable assumptions that usually guide behavior, forcing characters to choose based on their deepest convictions about human nature and ultimate meaning. Under this pressure, they must discover what they actually believe rather than what they think they believe. Sonia's continued faith, despite prostitution, Ivan's intellectual rebellion against divine justice, Alyosha's commitment to love despite witnessing cruelty. Each response reveals moral foundations that ordinary circumstances leave unexamined. This creates Dostoevsky's central insight about ethics. Understanding morality requires examining it under stress, where its true nature becomes apparent. The ethics of extremity don't represent special cases requiring different moral principles, but rather reveal moral truths that apply to ordinary circumstances whilst remaining invisible without crisis pressure. Every human choice, however mundane, ultimately rests on fundamental assumptions about dignity, responsibility, and meaning that crisis situations make explicit. The underground prophets who emerge from Dostoevsky's extreme scenarios carry moral knowledge that illuminates the hidden foundations of all human choice. Dostoevsky reveals a fundamental distinction between legal guilt and moral responsibility that cuts to the heart of human moral experience. In the legal realm, guilt corresponds directly to action. You are guilty of what you have done and innocent of what you have not done. Moral responsibility operates by entirely different principles. Dmitry Karamazov accepts responsibility for his father's murder despite his legal innocence, whilst Ivan bears genuine guilt for the crime despite never raising his hand against the old man. Their moral responsibility extends beyond their legal culpability because morality operates through the complex web of intention, influence, and spiritual complicity rather than simple causation. This distinction illuminates how moral consciousness functions through internal rather than external sanctions. Raskolnikov's torment demonstrates that genuine guilt cannot be escaped through rationalization or external justification. His psychological suffering after the murders reveals something profound about the nature of moral reality. It exists within consciousness as an objective force that cannot be reasoned away or dismissed through philosophical argument. The guilt operates as the voice of moral law within the human soul, creating an internal tribunal more exacting than any external court. The psychology of guilt in Dostoevsky's vision shows how moral awareness manifests through suffering that serves a redemptive purpose. Raskolnikov's anguish is not simply psychological dysfunction, but the recognition of moral truth breaking through the barriers of rationalized self-deception. His initial attempt to justify the murders through utilitarian calculation collapses under the weight of this internal moral reality. The guilt becomes the mechanism through which genuine moral consciousness reasserts itself against the distortions of abstract reasoning. Redemption in this framework requires acknowledgement of responsibility, acceptance of consequences, and commitment to transformation rather than mere forgiveness or absolution. Raskolnikov's journey from crime through punishment to spiritual renewal demonstrates how each stage proves necessary for genuine redemption. The process cannot be shortened or bypassed without remaining fundamentally incomplete. His confession to Sonia, his acceptance of punishment, and his gradual spiritual awakening each contribute essential elements to his moral restoration. This understanding reveals that moral development occurs through confronting rather than avoiding guilt and shame. Characters who accept their moral failure and work through it achieve greater moral maturity than those who avoid moral challenge altogether. Guilt becomes the beginning of wisdom rather than simply an obstacle to overcome. The underground consciousness recognizes that moral growth requires passing through the valley of moral acknowledgement rather than circumventing it through intellectual sophistication or emotional avoidance. The paradox emerges that those who feel most guilty often bear the greatest moral sensitivity, whilst those who feel no guilt may be most morally compromised. This creates the foundation for understanding how moral freedom operates, not through the absence of moral constraint, but through the conscious acceptance of moral responsibility that transcends simple legal or social obligation. The underground man's most disturbing insight concerns not his capacity for spite, but his recognition that genuine moral choice demands the freedom to choose evil. Dostoevsky reveals through his characters that constrained virtue is no virtue at all. The person who cannot sin cannot truly choose sanctity. This paradox cuts to the heart of moral philosophy. Authentic goodness requires the real possibility of authentic wickedness.
Consider Alyosha Karamazov's spiritual development.
His growing sensitivity to divine love simultaneously increases his awareness of evil possibilities. The monk's training does not shield him from temptation, but exposes him to subtler forms of corruption, spiritual pride, the temptation to judge others, the seductive power of his own goodness. Dostoevsky shows us that the saint and sinner share the same intensity of moral awareness. What differs is not their capacity for choice, but the direction of their choosing. This understanding transforms our conception of moral progress. Rather than moving toward greater ease in choosing good, moral development involves increasingly difficult moral struggle. Ivan Karamazov's intellectual sophistication makes his moral choices more rather than less agonizing. He cannot choose in ignorance of consequences and alternatives. His knowledge of suffering, of philosophical arguments against divine justice, of the complexity of human motivation, all this awareness creates greater burden rather than greater clarity. The Grand Inquisitor's kiss from Christ represents this paradox perfectly. Christ's response is not reasoned argument, but creative moral action that transcends both law and rebellion. He neither accepts nor rejects the Inquisitor's logic, but creates a third possibility through love. This gesture illustrates Dostoevsky's insight that moral freedom cannot be reduced to following rules or calculating consequences, but requires the capacity for creative moral response to unique situations. Dostoevsky's characters must invent their moral responses rather than simply applying predetermined principles. Raskolnikov's journey involves not just recognizing that murder is wrong, he knew this from the beginning, but discovering what it means to accept responsibility for his freedom, to choose evil. His confession to Sonia represents not submission to external authority, but acknowledgement of his infinite capacity for both destruction and redemption. This creative dimension of moral choice explains why Dostoevsky's characters often seem to choose badly when they could easily choose well. They are not simply weak or ignorant, but confronting the terrifying recognition that their choices create rather than merely select from existing moral possibilities. Each decision shapes not only consequences, but the very nature of good and evil in their particular situation. The ultimate insight emerges: moral freedom is not liberation from moral demands, but acceptance of infinite moral responsibility. The truly free person is not the one who can do anything without consequences, but the one who recognizes that everything they do has moral significance. This understanding of freedom as responsibility rather than license provides the foundation for addressing modernity's spiritual crisis, not through returning to external authority, but through embracing the full weight of moral creativity. Part 13. Synthesis, the complete vision. Dostoevsky's genius lies not merely in identifying individual problems with modern consciousness, but in recognizing how rationalism, individualism, and materialism form an interconnected system that generates the specific spiritual pathologies of his age. The underground consciousness doesn't emerge accidentally. It represents the inevitable result of rationalism's fundamental error, the attempt to reduce human nature to calculable self-interest. When consciousness accepts that human behavior follows rational laws of advantage, it discovers immediately that this reduction destroys the very freedom it claims to explain. The underground man's spiteful irrationality becomes not madness, but logic, the only way to assert human dignity against a worldview that denies human dignity exists. Revolutionary ideology, seemingly opposite to underground withdrawal, springs from the same poisoned well. Individualism, having dissolved traditional bonds of community and transcendent purpose, transforms into its apparent opposite, collective tyranny. The Grand Inquisitor understands this perfectly. Having rejected God, humanity becomes incapable of bearing freedom and demands to surrender it. Revolutionary movements promise individual liberation whilst constructing systems of total control, because individualism without transcendent grounding cannot sustain itself. The individual, cut loose from divine purpose, seeks meaning in historical progress, racial destiny, or class struggle ideologies that ultimately demand the sacrifice of actual individuals for abstract collective goods. Materialism completes this destructive trinity by ensuring that neither rational calculation nor revolutionary transformation can provide ultimate meaning. If consciousness is merely brain chemistry and human existence merely biological accident, then both underground spite and revolutionary fervor become equally meaningless. Ivan Karamazov's intellectual honesty leads him to this conclusion: if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted, but nothing matters. Nihilistic despair represents not a failure of logic, but logic's success. The recognition that materialist premises make human life fundamentally absurd. These seemingly different problems, underground consciousness, revolutionary ideology, nihilistic despair, are interconnected symptoms of the same spiritual crisis. Consciousness, divorced from transcendent purpose, becomes self-destructive regardless of its particular form. Raskolnikov's crime, Ivan's rebellion, and the underground man's spite all flow from the attempt to live as if material reality were the only reality. Each character represents a different strategy for dealing with this impossible situation, but each strategy fails because it accepts the false premise that generates the problem. Dostoevsky's most profound insight concerns the relationship between progress and regression in modern development. Material advancement, scientific knowledge, technological capability, social organization has been accompanied by spiritual regression. The Crystal Palace represents this perfectly, a triumph of engineering that becomes a prison precisely because it solves material problems without addressing spiritual needs. Modern consciousness gains power over external nature whilst losing connection to its own deeper nature. This creates new forms of suffering rather than eliminating suffering altogether. The underground man recognizes this paradox with devastating clarity. Rational egoism promises happiness through intelligent self-interest, but intelligent self-interest discovers that happiness cannot be pursued directly. The very attempt to calculate and control happiness destroys it. Similarly, revolutionary movements promise freedom through social reorganization, but social reorganization without spiritual transformation creates more sophisticated forms of slavery. Progress becomes regression because it addresses symptoms whilst intensifying causes. This diagnosis reveals why modernity's problems require spiritual rather than merely political or technological solutions. No amount of social reform can heal consciousness that has lost connection to transcendent meaning. No degree of material prosperity can satisfy souls that deny their own spiritual nature. Dostoevsky's complete philosophical vision culminates not in abstract theory, but in a therapeutic understanding of human existence, a comprehensive approach to healing both individual souls and social wounds. This therapeutic vision emerges from his profound insight that personal transformation and social regeneration are not separate processes, but interdependent aspects of a single spiritual reality. The therapeutic process begins with accepting radical responsibility for one's choices and their consequences. Raskolnikov's journey from crime through punishment to spiritual renewal provides the archetypal pattern. His healing occurs not through psychological analysis or social reform, but through the courage to face reality without comforting illusions. The therapy demands embracing suffering as potentially meaningful rather than simply evil to be eliminated. Dostoevsky understood that authentic healing requires moving through pain, not around it accepting that suffering, when voluntarily embraced rather than bitterly resented, becomes the crucible of spiritual transformation. This individual process connects directly to social healing through the revolutionary concept of sobernost, spiritual community that transcends both Western individualism and socialist collectivism. Characters like Alyosha and Sonia demonstrate how personal spiritual development creates authentic social change by transforming relationships one person at a time. They embody Dostoevsky's insight that genuine community preserves individual dignity whilst creating authentic connection through shared spiritual commitment. This represents his alternative to both individualistic competition and collectivist coercion. The therapeutic vision integrates individual spiritual development with social transformation through love and compassion, rather than through political revolution or rational planning. Dostoevsky's profound insight reveals that individual spiritual development without social engagement becomes selfish mysticism, while social reform without individual transformation becomes tyrannical manipulation. The complete vision shows how authentic spirituality must manifest in improved human relationships and social justice. This therapeutic understanding requires choosing faith despite doubt and uncertainty, not blind faith, but faith that emerges through wrestling with the deepest questions of existence. The healing process involves neither denying doubt nor surrendering to despair, but maintaining creative tension between faith and questioning. This dynamic creates the psychological space necessary for both individual growth and social progress. The therapeutic vision thus provides the foundation for addressing the eternal questions that define human existence, questions of meaning, mortality, love, and transcendence that no amount of social reform or individual therapy can eliminate, but which, when approached with courage and compassion, become sources of profound transformation rather than merely problems to be solved. Dostoevsky's enduring significance lies not in the answers he provided, but in his profound recognition that the ultimate questions about meaning, mortality, and moral responsibility cannot be definitively resolved. They must be continually engaged by each person and each generation. His characters don't solve these eternal puzzles, but demonstrate different ways of living with them, some destructively, others creatively. Ivan Karamazov's torment over the problem of evil, Raskolnikov's wrestling with moral freedom, the underground man's confrontation with rational determinism, these figures show us not solutions, but the very process of being human in the face of unanswerable questions. The philosophical method Dostoevsky pioneered involves living the questions rather than solving them. His characters exist in the tension between faith and doubt, love and freedom, individual dignity and social responsibility. Alyosha Karamazov represents not the person who has found final answers, but the person who has learned to live the questions with courage and compassion. He carries forward his elder Zosima's teaching, whilst maintaining his own capacity for doubt and growth. This is the spiritual maturity Dostoevsky points toward, not the elimination of uncertainty, but the cultivation of a way of being that can embrace mystery without despair. Human beings are uniquely the creatures who must ask these questions. Our humanity depends on maintaining the questioning rather than finding final answers that would eliminate the need for continued spiritual and moral development. Dostoevsky's characters become most human when they engage these questions most deeply, regardless of their particular conclusions. Even the underground man, in his perverse rejection of rational answers, demonstrates this essential human capacity. The moment we stop questioning the meaning of suffering, the nature of love, the possibility of genuine freedom, we begin to lose something essential about ourselves. This understanding transforms life from a problem to be solved into a spiritual adventure requiring courage, compassion, and commitment to ultimate meaning despite uncertainty. Dostoevsky's complete vision presents existence as an ongoing creative act in which we must continually choose how to live with the fundamental mysteries of human experience. His legacy is not a system of answers, but a demonstration of how to live with ultimate questions in ways that affirm human dignity
and create possibilities for love, growth, and authentic community. The questions remain eternal because they are renewed in each human heart. Each generation must discover for itself what it means to be free, to love genuinely, to bear suffering meaningfully, to hope authentically. Dostoevsky's profound contribution lies in showing us that this ongoing engagement with ultimate questions is not a burden to be escaped, but the very foundation of our humanity, the source of our capacity for growth, connection, and the creation of meaning in an uncertain world. Part 14, Conclusion. Dostoevsky's complete philosophical vision reveals the fundamental architecture of modern consciousness itself. The underground man's split between reason and freedom, the Grand Inquisitor's escape from freedom through ideology, Raskolnikov's confrontation with evil, and Alyosha's embodiment of love. These are not separate philosophical problems, but interconnected dimensions of a single spiritual crisis. Dostoevsky maps both the depths of this crisis and the heights of its potential transformation, showing us that modernity's essential challenge is learning to live consciously in the space between animal determinism and divine possibility. His ultimate insight penetrates to the heart of human nature. We are the creatures suspended between necessity and freedom, condemned to choose meaning whilst facing uncertainty, mortality, and moral complexity. This condition constitutes both humanity's burden and its glory. What makes us suffer our capacity for self-consciousness, moral reflection, and spiritual longing also makes us capable of love, creativity, and genuine transformation. We are indeed the underground prophets of our own possibility, carrying within ourselves both the diagnosis of our spiritual illness and the seeds of our healing. The therapeutic dimension of Dostoevsky's vision shows that spiritual health requires integrating psychological insight with transcendent commitment. Neither pure reason nor blind faith suffices for human flourishing. His characters who achieve genuine healing, Sonia, Alyosha, Zosima, combine intellectual honesty with spiritual commitment, psychological realism with transcendent hope. They demonstrate that the split between secular and sacred understanding can be healed through lived experience rather than theoretical resolution. Dostoevsky's prophetic significance lies in recognizing that modernity's crisis is fundamentally spiritual rather than political or technological. His anticipation of totalitarianism emerged from understanding that external freedom without internal transformation leads to new forms of spiritual slavery. His exploration of nihilism revealed that the death of traditional meaning structures requires not cynical despair, but the courage to create authentic spiritual life. His vision of authentic spirituality showed that genuine faith must pass through doubt, genuine love through suffering, genuine freedom through responsibility. The questions Dostoevsky explored: freedom and responsibility, faith and doubt, love and suffering, individual dignity and social connection, remain the essential questions of human existence. Each generation must engage them anew through the adventure of conscious living. His greatness lies not in providing final answers, but in showing us how to live these questions with courage, compassion, and commitment to the possibility that consciousness itself, despite its suffering, is the opening through which meaning enters the world.